Chapter 105. Tamar had unexpectedly reached level 6 alchemy. With the advantage of equipment and location, Brando could leave the crafting of the cursed crossbow to him without worry. Then, the young man took the poisoned dagger and the dwarven sword, called Badam, and prepared to meet the cripple in the Black Pepper Alley. He had been looking forward to meeting the cripple called Roan for some time, especially since he was eager to know if there were any follow-up quests for the Ring of the Wind Empress. From what he knew, the cripple had some connections with Braggs and those gray areas. Maybe he could even rely on the cripple to introduce him to those underground auction houses. Badam's red beard was too eye-catching, so the two of them put on a cloak to conceal themselves and left the house. Brando didn't see the merchant lady who said she would follow him. He didn't know where she had gone on her adventure again. But just as he pulled down the edge of his hood, he heard Badam say from behind, "Master Knight, I thought about it and felt that your method was not reliable enough." "What?" Brando hid the elven sword under his cloak and turned around to ask. "There were many refugees who saw us. Although you told them to keep their mouths shut, but when there are more of them, there will be more of them. It's hard to guarantee that there aren't people with bad intentions among them." Badam put his beard under his hood, looked left and right, and answered carefully. "This isn't a secret, but the nobles only want a result. If I don't show off, they will be more than happy to see it happen." Brando thought for a while and answered, "And what I need is a period of time without being noticed, Badam. But I still feel that we should have kept those refugees." Brando smiled. That was the truth of this guy's words. He shook his head and said, "Gathering the refugees openly would attract too much jealousy. Besides, not everyone is willing to follow us. Badam, people will grasp at straws when they are in trouble, but they won't hold on to them all the time." Badam nodded, but in his heart, he was somewhat disapproving. He thought that there might be a better way. Judging from Brando's way of doing things, Brando had always been by the young knight's side. Of course, he could tell that Brando was ambitious. Therefore, he hoped that Brando would pay more attention to the cultivation of his own strength. However, that was not what Brando was thinking about. He was more worried about attracting the attention of all for one. There were not many people who had seen him in Fortress Reden who were still alive, but if he performed too well, it would inevitably arouse suspicion. However, when he killed the White Knight, he only had a few close friends with him. This was his biggest reliance. Most people would find it hard to take a Black Iron ranked player like him seriously. But no matter what, there was still time. As long as he quickly grew stronger, All for One would be nothing more than a ghost hiding in the dark. Black Pepper Alley was one of the biggest slums in Braggs. In Brando's memory, this was not the first time he had come to this place where dirty water flowed and rats ran around the streets. But no matter what, under the hot summer weather, the stench that lingered around his nose made him feel extremely uncomfortable. On the contrary, Badam looked extremely natural. Mercenaries like them who were part of the Grey crowd were originally frequent visitors to this place. Brando knew that there were many dirty businesses hidden in the darkness of this alley. There were hyena-like bounty hunters and vulgar low-class prostitutes. Mercenaries, thieves, and illegal merchants mingled in this place. It was as if this place was born to give birth to the smell of crime and corruption. But in this place, among the poor people, one could occasionally see the most sincere scene between people. The young man was unable to evaluate this place, and had no intention of doing so. He saw the children wearing dirty clothes carefully avoiding him, and then hiding on both sides while greedily looking in his direction. He also saw the gazes around him that seemed to harbor ill intentions. He subconsciously raised his vigilance. Brando stopped in front of an old wooden door. He raised his head and saw the triangular mark on the crossbeam. After confirming that this was the cripple's house, he knocked on the door. Bang! 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 The wooden door looked like it was about to split open at any moment. A layer of dust fell from the top. Badam couldn't help but frown and said, "It's hard to imagine that there would be people living in this place. I've seen the people of Lunchik and the slums of Kovima, and I've never seen such a shabby place. Do you know, my lord, those people are already like cavemen," but before he could finish, the door under Brando's hand opened with a creak. The mercenary could only open his mouth and swallow the rest of his words back into his stomach. A sinister gaze fell on Badam from behind the door. After a moment, a hoarse voice spoke, "Brando. When did you return from Butchie? Oh right, you're actually not dead. That's really out of my expectations. What good would it do you if I died, cripple?" Brando replied coldly. He looked at the old man with a pointy mouth and monkey-like cheeks. The few strands of hair on the old man's head seemed to have all fallen off because he spent all his time scheming against others. However, the cripple didn't seem to be tired of it. He laughed in a low voice and stared at the two of them with his triangular eyes that were more white than green. He said, "What's the matter, Brando? You're rich now. You brought me a new guest." Before Brando left Bragg's, he pawned a lot of his personal belongings at the cripple's place. That was how he got involved with the cripple. The cripple had always been drooling over the oil painting in Brando's grandfather's house. In fact, Brando didn't know how the cripple knew about it. The young man glanced at the cripple. The sharpness in his eyes made the cripple shrink back. "You seem a little different, Brando." The old man hesitated. "After going through so much, everyone will change," Brando replied, but he didn't want to talk too much nonsense. Instead, he asked directly, "Do you still want my grandfather's oil painting?" The cripple was startled. His small triangular eyes immediately lit up. Of course, of course. What's the matter? You brought it. Brando." But before he could finish his words, he felt a sword shining with cold light at his neck. The man who spent all his time as a lone shark and scheming against others couldn't help but tremble. His legs went soft. "I don't have much patience. Tell me if my grandfather's oil painting was stolen by your people," Brando asked coldly. He stared at the man, his eyes emitting a cold light. Badam turned around and saw a few people turning around to run away. He picked up a few stones from the ground and threw them at them. He immediately beat them up until they were crying for their parents. Then he waved to Brendel and rushed over to the other side. The cripple saw this scene and felt even more uncertain. He couldn't help but scream, "Brando, listen to me. Of course it wasn't me. How would I dare to offend?" He suddenly realized that something was wrong and quickly shut his mouth. "Brendel, you know me, even though I don't wake up early if there are no benefits. Although I don't have any benefits, I won't break the rules." Brendel glanced at him and saw that his small triangular eyes were constantly moving around, and he knew that this guy had realized what was going on. He couldn't really kill him. Although he was a little disappointed, he still let go of the sword. "I accept your explanation. Let's talk about other business." "Other business? Brando, I can't take it if you do this kind of business a few more times." The cripple touched his neck as if to confirm that his head was still there. He couldn't help but say this with lingering fear. I lost that thing. My old man wants my life, so I have no choice but to take yours." Brendel's reply was half true and half false. The cripple hurriedly denied, I know. Don't worry, I'll help you find out about this." However, although he said this, he was cursing in his heart. Who was so bold as to break the rules and touch that thing? He couldn't help but look at Brando's hand, but it was empty as he thought. He thought for a moment and asked, "Speaking of your old man, Brando, I'm afraid your family is asking about you. Don't you want to go back and see?" Brando glanced at him. "I don't dare for now. I'll talk about it after I find it." Although he said this, he was afraid that he would bring trouble to his family if he went back. After all, this was an eventful period. It was better to endure it first. Thinking of his father, Brando couldn't help but sigh. Although he had another half of his soul, the original soul in his body was echoing this feeling. Okay. The cripple seemed to confirm that Brando really wouldn't trouble him. Then he continued, "What kind of business do you want to do, Brando?" "I need money urgently. I want to sell some good things." Brando glanced at the cripple, thinking that to deal with this kind of guy who bullies the weak and fears the strong, it was just like what Redo said. It was better to show him who was in charge first. "Of course, don't think about using the same trick you used to deal with me. I'm telling you, cripple, I'm no longer the Brando of the past." As expected, the cripple shrank his neck. "Don't worry, I won't pursue the things I pawned to you in the past. But this time, if you play tricks again, it won't be so easy." The young man threw a money bag at the cripple's feet. "I only need your referral. The reward is the same as before. In addition, I have 2 things I need your help with." Say it, the cripple replied hurriedly. "The first thing is to help me find a person. A woman in her 30s, with purple hair and eyes that are very rare in this area. If you have news of her within a week, immediately come to the Vlagenbund market to find me." The cripple nodded hurriedly when he heard it. He thought for a moment, but then he shook his head as if he had never seen such a person before. Brando didn't expect him to have news immediately, so he said, "The second thing is that I'm looking for another person. There used to be a small noble in this area called Borgnathan. You're the most famous local snake in Brags. You must know such a fallen noble, right?" When the cripple heard it, he hesitated for a moment and replied, "Brando, I think I've heard of this name before, but he disappeared a few years ago." "It doesn't matter. I'm looking for his wife." "Wife?" "That's right. His wife and his daughter." "Where do they live?" "His wife passed away 2 years ago. I know his daughter. She lives not far from here." "Brando, is this person your relative?" The cripple couldn't help but ask curiously. Unexpectedly, this sentence caused the elven sword to shake in front of him. The cripple shrank back, and Brando took the opportunity to put the sword back into the scabbard. He looked at the cripple and said, "You want to know?" "No, Brando, there's no need to. I'll tell you how to get there." The cripple immediately shook his head. P.S. The following is the original post that someone posted on LK. Stomach pain, cold, going out to eat, not eating for 2 days. Headache, stomach pain. Running away from home to rent a house. Family helping to manage it. We're all intelligent creatures. Your readers aren't kindergartners. There must be a reason for you to stop updating every time, and the reason is basically inexplicable. It doesn't even match up. Lying is a skill. Practice it more. Looking at this post, I couldn't help but feel disgusted. It turns out that my insistence on writing every day with stomach pain is a lie in the eyes of some people. My insistence on writing when the internet is cut off is also a lie. Damn, even if I want to find an excuse for being lazy, I have to be really lazy first. Everyone, calculate the number of words that Amber has written since he entered V. Not including today's update, there are 365,000 words. Excluding the 240,000 words in the public version, as of the 15th, there are 120,000 words in 15 days. That's an average of 8,000 words a day. This is called being lazy. Amber's writing is serious, but like many books, it's full of sloppiness. Everyone can see that. Seeing my own efforts, my own pain being called worthless by some idiots, my own efforts being ignored, my own pain being called a lie, it's really painful to die. Fortunately, these kinds of idiots are in the minority, and there are even more friends who are silently supporting me. Thank you guys are the motivation for me to continue writing. Here, I'm especially grateful to Frogda and Bloodda for supporting and defending me in that post. You guys used evidence to slap some trolls in the face, it's really satisfying. I sincerely hope that some trolls get out of this book is in your way, please have some self-respect. It's Chinese New Year, don't be like me, whose stomach is so bloated that it's about to explode, and it's so painful that I can't even sleep. Chapter 109. Brando was rather surprised to learn that Borgnesen's wife had passed away. He had hoped that the will left behind by the minor noble would bring him an unexpected income. Some of the noble families in Erewhon had a long history, and it was possible that Borgnesen's ancestors had been prominent for a period of time. Perhaps the wealth left behind would be an unexpected amount of wealth. Brando believed that the will would not specifically mention it if that was not the case. However, as Roan had said, his only hope now was the surviving daughter of Borgnesen. Roan had told them that the daughter of the minor noble was called Amandina. Rumor had it that she lived alone in St. Antoine's Grey Rat Street, right next to Black Pepper Alley. She had been living in seclusion all these years and rarely showed herself in front of outsiders. Although it was strange for a weak woman to live alone, she was still a descendant of a noble. In Erewhon, where the hierarchy was strict, most people would not dare to treat her lightly. Moreover, such a noble daughter was not considered special in Brags, especially for someone like Roan who sold information for a living. Most of the rumors he heard were 80% trustworthy. Brando analyzed the situation and agreed that Roan might not be lying. Of course, the number of people who had fallen for Roan's trick in Brags was said to be more than the rats in Black Pepper Alley. There were often rumors in the inn that Roan even dared to deceive dragons and adepts. It was enough to show how lawless he was. The young man was well aware of this, so he simply placed his shining silver sword on the bald man's neck and let this cunning old fox personally lead the way. On the other hand, the few idle youths that Roan raised finally understood that these two were not ordinary people after being taught a lesson by the red-bearded Badam. They obediently became obedient and allowed the three to leave Roan's lair unimpeded. It was almost evening when the three of them arrived at Grey Rat Street. The bronze sunlight shone through the buildings on one side of the old street, smearing thick shadows on the other side of the rows of wooden buildings. Because no one came to light the oil lamps on the side of the road, the whole street was silent in the darkness. Brando walked through the deserted street. His cloak swept across the stone slabs, and the breeze caused the fallen leaves to scatter. He couldn't help but look back. Badam couldn't help but frown when he saw this scene. He stroked his fiery red beard and cursed, "It wasn't like this when I came here a few years ago." Grey Rat Street was located near the present-day Cavalier Avenue, in the St. Anthony district where the old Parliament of Nobles was located. This was one of the prosperous old districts of Brags. In the past, it was considered a rich district where the nobles gathered. However, when the city was last reorganized, it had long been deserted. Now, this street was not much different from the Black Pepper Alley. They were both secluded places, but it was even more deserted. Because compared to the latter, there were no mercenaries, adventurers, or prostitutes. But it wasn't to the extent of being destitute. Brando breathed in the dusty air and suddenly thought of something. He replied, "It must be because of the underground cemetery." "That's right." The cripple laughed a little stuttered. The blade on his neck made him feel a little cold. "My lord, you might not know the situation as well as us locals. 2 years ago, there was a strange incident in the underground cemetery. A group of Hovel sect's monks and saints who were supposed to clean up the tombs mysteriously disappeared after entering the tombs. Because it involved 2 senior monks and a priest, this incident caused a huge commotion in Brugloss. And then, the Holy Cathedral didn't look for trouble with that old man Nagin." "I don't believe that," Badam asked. "Of course not. The Count was pressured by the Holy Cathedral to send the silver-winged cavalry into the cemetery to search. But they were attacked by monsters. In the end, only one person ran out with a mental disorder. What the hell? Bada muttered. The three of them talked as they followed the cripple down a dark staircase into an old apartment. The three-story wooden building looked like it was suffering from a serious asthma attack. The floorboards creaked as soon as one stepped on them. It was as if the entire corridor was shivering and could collapse at any time. Seeing such a scene, Brando couldn't help but stop. He used the thorn of light to poke at the cobweb-covered ceiling and asked, "Cripple, what is this place?" "If I remember correctly, Borg-Nessun has been missing for many years. But with his family background, he shouldn't be in such dire straits, right?" he said as he coughed. His daughter moved out of her home more than a year ago. "I think it was because she was cheated," the cripple replied. "A noble's daughter," Bada muttered. Brando looked at his neck and didn't say anything. The three of them finally stopped in front of a door at the corner of the corridor. Brando put away his sword and knocked on the door. He almost suspected that the sly old fox was lying to him again. But not long after, a violent coughing sound came from behind the door, and a soft voice asked, "Who is it?" Brando was startled. He turned around and asked, "Is she sick?" "I'm not sure." The cripple shook his head. Brando thought for a moment and answered from outside the door, "Miss Amandina, I'm a friend of your father, Mr. Nessun. I have something from him that I want to pass to you." There was a moment of silence behind the door, and the soft voice of a girl replied, "What is it?" Brando took out the will. "His letter." There was the sound of a chair being dragged away from behind the door, followed by a long hesitation. Then, there was the sound of footsteps and light coughing. The voice came to the door. The girl behind the door asked with a slightly expectant voice, "I'm sorry, but can you bring the letter in from below?" Brando looked down at the crack of the door and thought that the girl's alertness was quite high. However, when he thought about how she had been living alone for the past few years as a weak and delicate girl, he felt relieved. He nodded and replied, "I understand. Thank you." The letter was passed under the crack of the door, and there was the rustling sound of paper being opened. There was another long silence. Just when Brando was wondering what the other party was up to, the door creaked open. There was a girl in white pajamas standing behind the door. Her slender hands were holding the door, and she was panting a little, but her face was calm. She was not tall, only reaching Brando's chest. The girl had beautiful black hair that cascaded down like a waterfall. Against the faint candlelight in the room, her hair seemed to be plated with a layer of golden light. The edges of her long hair hung down to her waist. She looked at the three people outside the door with her gentle black eyes, looking a little nervous. "My father, he." Her gaze finally fell on Brando. Brando nodded. The girl's thick and dense eyelashes drooped down. She thought for a moment and replied, "Actually, I should have expected this. But it's good, at least my father and mother are together. Thinking about it like this makes me feel a little more at ease." Amandina's calmness surprised Brando. He thought that she was a weak noble lady who did not have the ability to handle matters. He looked past the girl and behind her. The room she lived in was not very comfortable. In the dim room, there was a shabby bed and a desk. Half of the candlelight on the desk had been burnt out, reflecting the scattered papers on the floor. This was almost all of her belongings. It looked like her living conditions were poor, just like he imagined. But this girl is also a scholar. Brando looked at the thick books on the desk and could not help but think. "My condolences, Miss Amandina." Brando thought for a moment and replied. Amandina looked up at him and coughed twice. She asked, "Do you want to ask about the inheritance mentioned in my father's will, sir?" Batum and Cripple, who were standing at the side, were confused. "Yes." Brando hesitated for a moment, then chose to be honest. Completing a mission to him was as natural as making a deal, or vice versa. He did not feel that there was anything shameful about it. Besides, he thought that getting this money would be beneficial to both him and the girl. Amandina folded the letter and frowned, but I've never heard my mother mention such a place. So it's a debt. Rowan seemed to understand something. Talking about this old profession made him 100 times more energetic. Brando, leave this matter to me. He spoke in a shrill voice as he used his eyes to observe Brendel's expression. He could see that this young man from before was now a person of importance, especially the tall mercenary beside him, whose skills were even more extraordinary. Rowan could not find anyone with such strength in his limited knowledge. He could not help but compare this person with a few noble guards he knew, and the result was that the former was better. He did not know why such a person was willing to work for Brando, and he could not help but become more cautious. No need, Rowan. Brando waved his hand and declined his kindness. It's only right to repay a debt. Rowan replied from behind, but when he saw Brando's fingers touch the hilt of his sword, he immediately shrunk his neck and swallowed the rest of his words. He muttered in a low voice, "There are rules, there are rules." Brando looked at the girl's clear eyes, as if to discern if she was lying. There was some worry in her eyes, but she did not look at him. It did not seem like she was deliberately lying. But to leave like this, Brando was a little unwilling. He could not help but frown. But after thinking about it, he could only smile in the end. Forget it, it's fine. It's just a small matter. Brando could not agree with Rowan's point of view. He could not force people into a dead end for a little benefit. Amandina had already lost both her parents, and her life could be considered to be in a difficult situation. How could he possibly want her to live in such a difficult situation? Of course, Rowan had his ways, but if he did that, it would be strange if the little Roman did not bite him to death. Moreover, if Freya found out, it would be even more terrible. Amandina coughed, but she endured it and straightened her body. She shook her head and said, "Sir, I don't need your charity." Brando was stunned. P.S. I was discharged from the hospital. I had to take 6 days of fluids and 4,000 gold coins. Then the doctor chased me out. He said that there would be no more beds for the spring festival, and I would have to come back in March for surgery. Damn it. This is a terrible system problem. Comrades, you must take care of your body. Pay attention to your diet, and have a regular schedule. Sigh, what a tragedy. I didn't listen to the advice of the elders before, but now I'm in trouble. The pain is excruciating, and I can't eat meat for the next 1 or 2 months. I can only eat porridge and vegetables. Oh God, translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 110. Not only was Brando surprised by her answer, but even Badam and Rowan also raised their heads to look at her. Amandina stared at the young man and replied, "Don't worry, sir. Whether it is to fulfill my father's promise or to express my personal gratitude, I will complete this task." Brando was taken aback. He could not help but look at the noble's daughter, as if trying to discern whether her answer was due to pride or stubbornness. However, from the firm and clean face of the young man, he could read a combination of both, and even a little bit of confidence. Where did her confidence come from? Brando was at a loss for a moment. The development of this matter was getting more and more out of his expectations. "How do you plan to complete this task, little girl?" Badam asked from behind. He looked at Amandina from head to toe, and could not help but use the vulgar and teasing tone of a mercenary to reply, "Even though you can be considered a pretty little girl, our lord already has a fiancée, little girl." Amandina was a noble's daughter. Even though she was in dire straits, she had never heard such vulgar words. She was so angry that her pale face turned red, but she did not want to talk to a vulgar guard. She could only look at Brando, her eyes filled with disappointment. Then she turned around and walked to the desk, opened the drawer, and took out a scroll. She hesitated for a moment, but in the end, she walked over and handed it to Brando. I believe its value is not lower than your estimate, sir. She thought for a moment, and answered simply. What is this? Brando asked. My work. Amandina was a little nervous when she said this, but she immediately became confident again. Roan snorted at the side. Badam looked at him and could not help but poke him. How much money do you think this little girl owes our lord? Roan was stunned, and could not help but raise his head to look at this guy. Even though Badam's long hood covered his face, the short cripple could still see the beard on his face. You don't know? He asked. Of course, Badam whispered. Why should I know? I thought you knew. Roan glanced at him and began to calculate for him. A noble like Borg, even if he's a little down, he should still be able to leave behind at least 1,000 or 2,000 Tors worth of annual income. That's close to 100,000 Tor coins. It's not a lot, but it's not a little either, old friend. That is indeed a large sum of money. Badam nodded. Are you saying that the scroll in Sir's hand is worth 100,000 gold coins? I didn't say that, but it's possible if it's a painting by a famous artist. It's not surprising that some masters' works are worth millions. However, that little girl had already said that it was her work. To tell you the truth, I don't think any of her works are worth that much. Otherwise, would this little girl still live in this kind of place? You're really a snob. This is only a reasonable speculation, my lord. Amandina could not help but clench her fists when she heard their conversation. Brando held the scroll in one hand and did not stop the conversation between Roan and Badam. He was a little confused at this moment. What is this scroll? Is it a magic scroll recorded on a long piece of parchment? Or is it a copy of an ancient document? Or is it just as Roan said, Amandina's painting? He had seen many of these scrolls in his past life. Some of them were priceless, and some of them were worthless. He stared at the parchment that was burnt to a crisp. It was a thick stack of parchment. The paper was not of good quality, but it felt heavy in his hands. For a moment, he was unsure where Amandina's confidence came from. Can I take a look at it? He asked. It's already yours. Brando nodded and carefully opened the scroll. What entered his eyes was a complicated line drawing. A large number of lines formed a mechanical pattern. Mysterious patterns and magic circles filled the drawing. Every blank space was filled with a long explanation in beautiful handwriting. Brando only took one look and felt the world spinning. It was not a surprise, but a sudden realization. So that's how it is. He immediately closed the scroll with his heart beating faster. This was the design of the most primitive mana-conducting device. The drawing was quite rough and could not be compared to most of the mature products in this era. From the drawing, it could be seen that the designer did not have much talent in this field. It could even be said to be clumsy. Because of this, it was a clumsy work. But at this moment, Brando's heart was filled with understanding. So that's how it is. How did Origin, one of the top 10 player factions in The Amber Sword, obtain the blueprint from the production and design of the mana-conducting device that was monopolized by the Empire's royal family? How did it open the prelude to the era of independence for the players? So that's the answer. Brando did not expect to encounter such a thing before he came here. He had never connected this weak girl with one of the top 10 puzzles in The Amber Sword in his previous life. They seemed to be two completely unrelated things. He did not even consider the possibility in that direction. If he had to describe his feelings at this moment, it would be that there was no warning and he was caught off guard. It turned out that the leader of Origin, staff, did not infiltrate any of the empires. He had completed this hidden quest line from the beginning. Brando used almost all of his willpower to keep his expression from changing too much. The blueprint in his hand could be said to be of epic-making significance. There were three kinds of power in this world. The first kind of power was called the elements, or a higher level of existential power. Fire, wind, water, earth, truth and law, time and space, and even matter itself were all existential powers. Those who could master this power were called warriors, elementalists, wizards, and all kinds of powerful beings. It was just that different powers showed different characteristics in their bodies, but they all had a common measurement, which was Oath energy level. The power of the elements was a hidden existence in different people until the power of the person exceeded 500 energy levels, OZ. In the description of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, it was called Elemental Awakening. Since then, these people would be crowned with the title of Knight of the Holy Cathedral. This would be a long and even untouchable process because in Wond, most people were born with only 0.3 energy levels, OZ, in their bodies. They would not be able to reach such a height even if they spent their whole lives. But the heavens always favored some people, and there was no lack of such people in this world. They were born with such qualifications, so they were called the chosen ones. The second kind of power was not human. It was called the power of God, which was also the power of faith. The gods in Wond had long been divided into two divine systems, Hilmer and Einka. Hilmer was secular, while Einka was arrogant, but the gods controlled the sun, moon, stars, and the laws of all things on earth, so they were called gods. Their existence depended on this world, or it could be said that they were the projections of the laws in the sky. They did not need people to worship them, but the small mortals feared these powerful beings and developed faith in them. The gods also responded to their people. This response was the power of God, the power controlled by the priests. The source of this power was the will of the gods to transform this world, and also the care of the high and mighty beings for their children. Because of this, there were many sects on earth arguing day and night. The arguments between them originated from the misinterpretation of the gods' will, or the confusion of the gods themselves to transform this world. As for the third kind of power, it was the power of wisdom, and also the power of mortals to transform the world. The magical device in Brando's hand was also known as the mana pivot. It was the source of all magical power in this world. Through the non-artificial, mechanical, conversion of the energy in magical elemental crystals, it could provide power for small magical guns, large warships, and even floating cities. It was the invention of the Bugha craftsmen, and soon it was secretly mastered by the royal families of the great empires. This brand new power created by mortals quickly changed the structure of this world. Starting from the rapid development of productivity, it led to great changes, and the ensuing conflicts of power and resources, as well as the Holy War and the November War that lasted for decades, all of these caused the world to become turbulent in the past 100 years. And now, Brando held the root of this turbulence in his hand. The significance of this blueprint was that although it was not technologically advanced compared to most similar mana pivots in this era, and could even be said to be far behind, the conversion efficiency was at least 30 years behind, but it changed the essence of the mana pivot that was monopolized by a few people. In the Amber Sword, this mana pivot named Star, designed by Amandina, was first created in the player's territory 20 years later, and it was also the symbol of the rise of the players below the NPCs. And at this moment, this symbol was in his hand. He could not help but take a deep breath and asked, "You designed it?" Amandina's face was originally a little nervous, but when she heard the question, she was surprised. You can understand it." She could not help but ask. All of her knowledge came from books, although all of her interest and energy had been devoted to the design of mana pivots for a long time. Her former teacher also told her that her talent did not lie in this, and that if she wanted to continue on this path, her achievements were destined to be limited. But Amandina still invested all of her money and effort into this path, especially after the death of her parents. She devoted herself wholeheartedly. She sold her family's property, and even almost fell into the trap of a flirtatious merchant. If not for her noble status protecting her, she was afraid that she would have become someone's plaything. But Amandina did not give up. In particular, she insisted that perhaps she had found a way to lead to the mana pivot. She had designed many blueprints, and this was just one of the ideas. It had a fatal flaw, and that was that it consumed too much energy to make the finished product look a little unrealistic. But the little girl still stubbornly believed that her design was worth the price. But she was prepared to be ridiculed by Brando, and she mustered up her courage, but this was the answer that she was waiting for. He could understand it. It's very rough, but at least it's a finished product. Brando replied. No, sir, you don't understand. Amandina coughed and replied, this design is actually a half-finished product, the input and output are not proportional at all. What? You dare to use a half-finished product to repay your debt? Rowan jumped up when he heard this from behind. But Brando motioned for Badam to stop him, and then looked at Amandina and replied, it's fine, in my opinion, this is a good deal. You have fulfilled your promise, Miss Amandina. You have indeed paid enough, and even more. He was not lying, and it was indeed more. Compared to the Borg's treasure, this was more of an unexpected gain. Amandina could not help but widen her eyes. P.S. Although I'm a little ashamed that this month's updates are much less than expected, I still shamelessly ask for your votes. Chapter 111. Then I'll take my leave. Brando put away the scroll, but when he looked at Amandina's situation, he couldn't help but feel sorry for her. He hesitated for a moment before asking. Is there anything I can help you with? Amandina shook her head. No need, thank you. She leaned against the door and whispered, thank you for bringing me news about my father, sir. She coughed twice. Brando couldn't help but think that she was a confident and stubborn girl. He thought about it for a moment, and he didn't have much money on hand. Even if he wanted to help others, he would have to wait until after the auction that Cripple had arranged for him. When he was about to leave, he heard the sound of messy footsteps coming from the stairs not far away. Everyone was startled and turned around at the same time. There are quite a lot of people. Badam put his hand under his cloak. 7, no, 8. Don't be nervous, this is Braggs. Brando stopped Badam and stared in the direction of the stairs. But as soon as he finished speaking, there was a burst of curses coming from down the stairs. Fuck, I really don't want to come to this damned place. That girl is so stubborn, I think we came here for nothing. Shoot, these noble ladies are all like this, they're so arrogant on the surface. As long as we scare them a little, I guarantee that they'll tremble like little animals. No matter what we ask them to do, they'll obediently hand over the things. In my opinion, the Baron already said that it won't be a big deal even if we do it with her. She's just a fallen noble. If we don't teach that damned girl a lesson, she won't know what we do. What do you know? How can you believe the words of a noble? They're worse than the demons in the underworld. A group of people appeared at the corner of the stairs, just in time to meet Brando, Badam, and the others. There were exactly 8 of them, and all of them were wearing the new light gray uniform of the Public Security Cavalry. They obviously didn't expect there to be people upstairs, and almost all of them had an expression of surprise on their faces. Their eyes first fell on Amandina, then back to Brando and Badam, and finally to Cripple who was blocked at the back. It's you. Cripple, what are you doing here? The leader frowned and asked. Brando stopped Cripple and asked, who are they? A hooligan from Hood District. I didn't expect you to become so pretentious after not seeing you for a few days. You're even wearing leather. Cripple's eyes flashed as he stared at the security cavalry uniform on the other party. It seemed that he didn't like these people. Humph, nothing good comes out of a dog's mouth. A person on the other side cursed. But the leader stopped his comrade, and Brando's actions showed that he was the leader of the 3. The leader couldn't help but feel a little confused. Even though Cripple from the Black Pepper Alley wasn't a great person, he had always been a loner, and was famous in their circle. But today, He was with these two unknown people. What was the meaning of this? Especially when they were together with the daughter of the fallen noble, things became a little troublesome. You are. He thought for a moment and decided to test them first. Brendel glanced at him but did not pay any attention to him. He turned back and saw Amandina's hands gripping the door frames so tightly that her joints were a little white. The girl lowered her head, and even though she didn't speak, these subtle movements made the young man feel the fear and panic in her heart. He thought for a moment and asked, "Are they here to cause trouble for you?" Amandina nodded. "What's the matter?" "They said that my father owes them money." "Your father can't be a gambling addict, right?" "Why do they all lack money?" Cripple, who didn't know the truth, muttered from behind, but he immediately saw the girl's eyes that were about to spit fire. He was so scared that he subconsciously swallowed the rest of his words. "Does your father owe them money?" Brando asked. Amandina's eyebrows furrowed and she shook her head. "How could my father have dealings with people like them?" Brando thought for a moment and turned back. "And who are you?" His words were steady and powerful, and the leader of the group saw that Brando spoke in an orderly manner. He was already a little afraid, and his heart skipped a beat. He thought that this young man must have some backing. Even though he couldn't see Brando's face under the shadow of his hood, he could tell his age from his voice. He hesitated for a moment and didn't dare to blame Brando for ignoring his rudeness. After thinking for a while, he said, "We are the Knights of the Order of Knights under Hadel's rule. I'm Alf John, and these are my brothers. We were entrusted by Viscount Tersch to collect the debt." "Since when were the Knights of the Order of Knights in charge of this?" Badham crossed his arms and couldn't help but sneer at the back. The 7 or 8 people in front of him were embarrassed. A few weeks ago, they were just a bunch of commoners who hadn't seen much of the world. Now that they were in front of this mysterious young man, they couldn't do anything, and they couldn't refute him either. The leader of the group wanted to slap himself in the face, but he didn't expect to be caught red-handed. Fortunately, one of them couldn't help but grumble, "It's only right to repay a debt." Brando looked at them and asked, "Who do you want to collect the debt from?" The Knights of the Order of Knights fell silent again. They looked at each other, and the leader finally answered, "It's the young lady behind you, sir. Her name is Amandina, and her father owes Tersch a large sum of money." Brando scratched his ear. Tersch's name sounded familiar, but he couldn't quite remember it. He thought that this kind of person must have a certain level of fame in the Amber Sword, but had deviated from the main story. This kind of person was either an insignificant character like the Golden Apple Lord, or a person who was better at hiding his or her identity. He turned around and asked, "Who is Tersch?" "A young man about the same age as you. He's the deputy of the leader of the Silver-Winged Knights, Mechk. There are rumors that he's the illegitimate son of the Duke." Roan's face changed and whispered, "Brando, it's best if we don't get into a conflict with these people. They're Tersch's men, and you can't afford to offend them." The old man couldn't help but wipe the sweat off his forehead. Fortunately, he didn't speak too disrespectfully, or else he would have gotten himself into trouble. But once he regained his composure, the cunning old fox began to think about how to get out of this mess. But Brando heard the hidden meaning in his words and smiled. "Cripple, you seem to want me to get into a conflict with this Tersch that I've never met before?" he asked. No, I wouldn't dare. The cripple, Roan, laughed awkwardly. He didn't expect the other party to see through his little trick so easily. But he didn't know that Brando knew his little trick like the back of his hand. Brando looked at Amandina again, and saw that her face had turned pale. She had obviously heard Roan's words. Compared to her father, Mechk and the Duke of Grenoires were people of a higher status. If these people wanted to cause trouble for her, she could only close her eyes and wait for death. But Brando thought that Mechk, the leader of the Silver-Winged Knights, was a noble with a military background, but in reality, he was a lackey of the unifying guild. Terce didn't have much of a reputation in the Amber Sword, and the only thing he was famous for was his illegitimate son. Brando finally understood why he wasn't sensitive to this person's name. The only thing that puzzled him was that it was rare for the nobles of Wone to kill each other. Even if the royal family tried to seize power, it would only be done under the table. Terce knew about Amandina's situation, but what was the meaning behind his actions? Was there a grudge between the ancestors? It didn't seem like it. Brando couldn't help but think that Terce might have taken a liking to Amandina. That was not impossible as the nobles often played this game. But this is a little troublesome. Let's not talk about whether she's willing or not, but I'm not willing either. The value of the designer of the mana conduction device is almost immeasurable. I'm not going to let her slip away from me. I didn't want to express my desires so urgently. Firstly, I want her to lower her guard, and secondly, it's the nature of a merchant to bargain when doing business. But it seemed that the plan had to be changed. He turned around and asked, "Does your father know Terce?" Amandina quickly shook her head. She was a smart girl, and immediately figured out what Terce was trying to do, just like Brando. She had never seen Terce before, but his methods were disgusting. She subconsciously thought of the closest person she could rely on. She couldn't help but look at Brando, feeling a little nervous. However, Brando did not disappoint her. The young man immediately drew his sword after hearing that. The gleaming elven sword sent chills down everyone's spines. Drawing his weapon meant that the negotiation was over. However, the leader still wanted to salvage the situation. He cleared his throat and was about to speak, hoping that Brando would consider Terce's influence, but before he could, Brando had already swung his sword. Swoosh! A ripple passed by everyone, like an invisible gust of wind. The pressure of the wind made everyone's hair flutter in the air. That was only for a moment. Then, with a click, a button that was nearly 5 meters long was opened on the ceiling. There was silence in the dim corridor. P.S. Thank you, my friends, for your concern and love. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support legal reading. Chapter 112. Sword Aura. Roan's expression changed. He could not help but take a closer look at Brando. He suspected that this young man was not the one he knew. The Brando he knew was just a young man who came out of the militia. Perhaps he had some reputation for his swordsmanship, but it was impossible for him to become a master swordsman who had awakened his elemental power in just half a year, right? Amandina gripped the door frame tightly, then let go. The sudden turn of events had exceeded the limits of her imagination. She bit her lips. She did not expect that the person who brought news of her father would be a gold-ranked swordsman. Such a young great swordsman. She could not help but wonder if this young man was actually an enlighter who was born with the power of a level 1 elementalist. Batum crossed his arms and remained calm. He took in everyone's reaction and couldn't help but chuckle in his heart. The first time he saw this knight display such a sword technique, he was also shocked. Of course, he also had a faint sense of superiority because he knew that Brando's true strength was not limited to this. As for the Knights of the Order, they were already stunned. They tried their best to guess Brando's identity, but even with their limited imagination, they could only think that he was a noble, or even a descendant of a large family. They didn't dare to think about it any further. But who would have thought that such a young swordsman would appear in front of them? Of course, it was possible that Brando was not a great swordsman at all. But he did not mind creating such a misconception in front of these people. Just like what he wanted, this impression was deeply engraved in their hearts, enough to make them want to retreat. Brando retracted his sword and replied, "Did you hear that? This young lady said that her father does not know Terce. But The leader finally recovered from the shock and spoke subconsciously with a conflicted expression. Brando secretly made a gesture to Badam. But what? Hurry up and get lost. The red-bearded mercenary looked at Brando and immediately turned back to order sternly. The few of them looked at each other. Brendel clearly did not want to reason with them. They were familiar with this attitude, but they usually did not bother to reason with others. They wanted to directly attack, but the person standing in front of them was a swordsman of the Order of the Thistle. Even without the bodyguard's help, the young man alone could take them all down in 10 seconds. The leader almost choked, but he took a deep breath and forced himself to calm down. He replied, "I understand, sir, you have decided to interfere in this matter. In that case, I hope you can let us know who is going against Lord Terst." Brendel glanced at this guy and thought that he was quite the character to use words to provoke him. If he was a real noble, but he was a swordsman. However, he was also secretly vigilant, because if he refused to answer, it might cause these people to suspect his identity. The leader of this group was quite clever. This kind of scheme that was put on the table could be said to be an open conspiracy. The Owl, John. Brendel made a mental note of this name. He thought for a moment and smiled inwardly. He took out a piece of paper from his bosom, folded it in half, and threw it over. "Give this to your Lord Viscount. As for my identity, you are not qualified to know." The few of them were stunned as they looked at the folded piece of paper on the ground. Left with no other choice, these people could only obediently pick up the pieces of paper and dejectedly return to where they came from. They only gave the cripple a deep look and did not say anything else. Of course, Brando had the initiative, so they would only embarrass themselves if they said anything. After the last person disappeared around the corner, Brando turned around. The first person he saw was Roan. He could not help but smile and asked, "What are you thinking about, Mr. Roan?" In fact, other than Badam, this cripple was the only one who knew his true identity. Batum could be trusted, but this cunning old fox was a different story. "No, nothing," Roan quickly denied. The little old man's heart was filled with bitterness. He did not expect that leading the way would cause such a big disturbance. If he had known, even if Brendel really wanted to stab him to death, he would not have stepped into this muddy water. Needless to say, he had offended Terst. At the very least, Terst had remembered him. His days in Brags would not be so easy. But this was not the most important thing. He knew this, and he believed that the young man beside him knew this as well. As for whether Brando would trust him, even Roan did not trust himself. But he happened to know Brando's true identity. Would he go to Terst to explain and reveal Brando's true identity? There was no need to think about it. That was what he thought. But he could not help but look at Brando. This young man would not give him the chance to do so. What would Brando do? If it was the old Brando, it would be hard to say. But now, this young man was a lot more decisive than when he left Brags. Roan could not help but feel a chill down his spine. He could almost imagine what would happen to him. The more he thought about it, the more afraid he became. In the end, he even began to tremble. "Be Brendel, if you kill me, they will definitely suspect your identity." Roan could not help but stutter as he replied. "It's the same if I go missing." Brando smiled. Yes, the cripple replied bitterly. "But you don't want us to believe you, do you, Mr. Roan?" "How likely do you think it is?" Brando asked. "Yes, a little." Brando looked at him with some disgust, but he still shook his head. "I won't kill you, Roan." Roan was slightly stunned. He looked at Brando in disbelief. His small eyes flashed, as if he was wondering why this young man would say such a thing. Lie to him. It did not seem necessary, but Brendel did not look like a naive person at the moment. He thought hard for a long time, but could not come up with a reason. Could it be that this young man had a wicked hobby of toying with his prey? He could not help but feel his hair stand on end. But Brando replied, "Have you heard of a pledge of allegiance, Roan?" "What?" "You don't know. It doesn't matter. You just need to understand that as long as you hand over something like this, we will be on the same side." Brando smiled and replied, "You want to drag me down with you?" Roan sucked in a breath of cold air. The young man's smile was similar to the devil's in his eyes. He hesitated for a long time, but decided that this was the only way. In any case, he had to trick this young man first. But how could he gain the other party's trust? Snitch. But he was not familiar with Thirst. Kill one of his men. Nobles would not care about such a small matter. Roan hesitated for a long time, but Brando continued, "Roan, did you commit any crimes in Iraq before you joined this line of work?" Roan's heart seemed to have been struck by lightning. His expression changed as he looked at Brando as if he had seen a ghost. "No, no. That noble is called, Stop." Roan screamed. His face was ashen as if he had just been fished out of water. He was sweating profusely as he gasped for air. He raised one hand and shouted, "I understand, Brando, stop talking. I know what I have to do." "Damn it, Brando, you must be a devil. I have never offended you." Brando smiled. Roan killed a noble family in Iraq 30 years ago and changed his name to Braggs. This was a famous quest in the Amber Sword. The guy's future was not good, and he was hanged. But it was not the cripple's fault, and the noble was not necessarily a good person in the story. Roan was only telling Roan about this to force him to join him. In Erewhon, Roan's crimes were second only to treason. Roan believed that even Thirst would not be able to protect Roan. Only by relying on this would he be able to control Roan. But he saw that Roan's emotions were unstable, so he tried to calm him down. "Don't worry, Roan. I am not trying to use this to threaten you. I know the cause and effect of this matter. You are not at fault. But I have no intention of being a messenger of justice. I am only trying to protect myself. As for you following me, I can at least guarantee that Thirst won't cause you any trouble. I hope you remember that this is a win-win situation, and not a situation where one side has to obey the other." The cripple looked at him suspiciously. "You don't believe me?" "The piece of paper I gave them said it all, Roan." Brando replied. "What was that piece of paper?" Badam couldn't help but ask. "It's just a small habit. I'm sure Thirst will suspect a reasonable opponent based on that note." Brendel smiled. He didn't know if Thirst was involved with the unifying guild, but it didn't matter. Roan decided to stir up the conflict between Thirst and the tree herders first. Count Turtledove was one of the core members of the tree herders, and he was also the main political enemy of the Duke of Grenoires. He was also an admirer of Thirst's fiancée. Brando thought that this identity would be enough to give Thirst a headache. Perhaps Thirst would be able to clear up the mystery, but it didn't matter. After all, Brando had nothing to lose. He wasn't a knight of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, and he didn't have to speak the truth to his enemy. Roan was stunned for a moment after listening to Brendel's words. He looked at Brando and couldn't help but say, "I really wonder if you are a demon in disguise, Brando. You weren't like this before." "I am forced by the situation." Brando shrugged and looked at Amandina, who was listening to their conversation. "What do you plan to do, Miss Amandina?" he asked. Amandina lowered her head. She knew that the choice was no longer in her hands. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made the wrong decision. After all, this young man did not seem to be as courteous as she had imagined. She thought for a moment, and could only answer in a small voice with some reluctance, "Didn't you already consider everything for me, Mr. Brendel?" Brando smiled. Amandina's intelligence should put many noble ladies to shame. He really didn't know what kind of environment she grew up in to produce such a girl. But since Amandina didn't mind, he didn't need to be pretentious. He patted the scroll in his arms and answered, "Miss Amandina, I actually saw your talent and ability, and I hope that you can work for me. I need your ability, and in return, I am willing to support you in your research. Of course, as my person, I will naturally ensure that you will not be harassed by those people before." Amandina coughed twice and looked up at Brando. Her bright eyes looked straight into Brando's eyes, as if to confirm whether he was lying or not. "You want me to make these machines for you? But my mentor said that I'm not very talented in this area." "Indeed," Brando nodded, "but there are many craftsmen who make and design Magitech devices, but I can only find one person who is proficient in that design. That is only a half-finished product." Amandina became serious and interrupted him. But she immediately realized that she was being rude and couldn't help but lower her head and shrink back. But Brando didn't mind. He asked in return, "Miss Amandina, you gave me a half-finished design as a thank you, which means that you have confirmed its value. Then why don't you allow me to give it a higher evaluation? There is an old saying in my hometown, everything is difficult at the beginning. This saying is enough to evaluate the value of your design." Amandina was slightly startled, her eyes shining. "Everything is difficult at the beginning?" She looked up again and asked tentatively, "Then, Mr. Brando, are you really willing to support me on this path? To be honest, I don't have the funds right now, and I don't even have a foothold for myself. But I think I will have it soon." Brando answered frankly, "Is that right, Mr. Ron?" "That's right, that's right." The clueless cripple hurriedly nodded his head. Amandina thought for a moment and bit her lips. "Very well," she nodded, her bright eyes filled with determination. "I accept your offer, Mr. Brando. But I don't want to be idle. Before you have enough strength, I am willing to be your assistant. Only when I see it with my own eyes can I be at ease. Besides, I believe that I have the ability to." She stared straight at Brando as she answered. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 113. In July, the air in Bragg seemed to be filled with a kind of heat that made people restless. Under the calm surface, undercurrents were surging. It was foreseeable that the big and small nobles were in a terrible fix over the past half a month. In their circle, the signs of the end of the war were becoming more and more obvious. Although the life of the lower-class citizens was still as usual, those who wanted to take the opportunity to make a fortune were gradually becoming restless. The citizens often saw the messengers' horses entering the city one after another. Those who did not know the situation would think that the war was urgent, but these letters were the progress of the negotiations in Winterrose Castle. As a result, the civilians were anxious all day long, and the nobles were also anxious all day long. But all this had nothing to do with Brando. The young man was steadily following his schedule. He spent 3 days bribing his connections to get a registration certificate of a pioneer knight. It was a document that stated the mutual loyalty and responsibility between knight and king, and then stamped with a seal. This thin piece of parchment was more valuable than gold in the early years, but as Eroe gradually declined, the knight class degenerated into a local force, and the adventurers turned to illegal businesses. No one was enthusiastic about expanding the territory of this ancient kingdom, so the title of a pioneer knight gradually became obscure. Since the ascension of the former king, the nobles who had made a fortune through the identity of a pioneer knight gradually began to set a price for this title, and this piece of parchment became less and less valuable since then. In order to get this identity, Brando, just like what he did in the game, asked Badam to buy a beautiful dress for the wife of a municipal official. It was already the 11th when he got the document. On this day, the cripple brought him another piece of good news. The long-awaited underground trade fair had finally arrived. Just like the regular fairs in certain areas, Braggs's Grey Realm would hold an underground trade fair on the 10th day of the month. It was just that most of the goods sold in this fair were stolen goods, contraband, and even human trafficking. It was not surprising because the people who participated in this trade fair were not only mercenaries, adventurers, and illegal merchants, but also the people who made the rules in Braggs. Namely, the nobles. There was no doubt that the local underground forces were controlling this underground market, but it was inevitable that some nobles would intervene. This was an open fact. And it was enough to hide from the ordinary citizens who needed a peaceful and stable society. Braggs's underground trade fair was regularly held in Maria's Market in Hood District or Shepherd's Market in the East District. The organizers deliberately chose densely populated places to hide from the public. But often, a lot of people would often find a large number of unfamiliar faces in these two places. They would ask questions, chat, and then leave in a hurry the next morning. In particular, these two markets also had a small auction house for rental. Of course, this was just an excuse on the surface. In fact, apart from the occasional use of these two auction houses, they were almost exclusively built for this regular gathering. If you tried to find their owners, you would only find them of an ordinary merchant nearby. However, if one were to investigate further, they would discover that these two buildings were actually funded by the local noble parliament. Of course, these were all digressions. When Badham led Brando down from the carriage, the sunset in Braggs was just like the one in the oil painting of the same name. It was like an orange-red fireball hanging in the sky, burning the surrounding clouds red. The young man was wearing a knight's uniform, which was ironed neatly. The Shire, an apprentice wizard, stood beside him, so that they could disguise themselves as the Highland Knight from Karsuk and his squire. Of course, there was also Brando's sister, Amandina, and his fiancée, the Roman lady, who came down from the carriage. Amandina removed her hand from Brando's hand as soon as she got down from the carriage. She was wearing a black veil and a black dress. Her eyes were indifferent as she stared at the people coming and going outside the small auction house. The young girl lightly pursed her lips. Her aura was completely different from a few days ago. When she first met Brando, she gave off a soft and tender feeling, but now she was cold, and her body naturally emitted an aura that kept people away. Even if the owl John came to see Amandina, he would not dare to rashly greet her, let alone thirst spies. What's more, at this critical juncture, something as trivial as a person going missing in a big city wouldn't attract any attention at all. The cemetery area was already a dangerous place to begin with, so much so that the city officials only discovered their negligence a few days later from the actions of their colleagues. Originally, missing people should be the responsibility of the city guards, but before that, the security cavalry had already conducted a large-scale search. The scale of the search could be considered an exception. 3 companies of cavalry almost turned the eastern part of the city upside down, and almost alerted the local nobles in Braggs. However, since Viscount Hurst didn't want this incident to fall into the ears of others, he decided to let it go. In the end, the entire incident was linked to the cemetery attack that happened half a year ago. Thus, it became a case without any clues. That was why Amandina could be at ease when she appeared outside. Standing beside her was Romaine, who was slightly taller than her. The merchant girl was staring intently at a row of crystal balls on the table not far away. She furrowed her brows as if she was trying to figure out what it was. But what made Brando a little dumbfounded was that there was not a single word written on the crystal ball, and no matter how long she stared at it, there would not be any flowers growing on it. He knew that she was only doing this to attract Amandina's attention. For the past few days, Romaine and Amandina had gotten along quite well. Romaine had a naturally sharp sense of smell, and she was able to sniff out the scent of an opportunity. However, Amandina had the knowledge of the outside world that Romaine lacked, and she also had some necessary knowledge. For example, if no one told this future merchant girl that the Anzac region had always been responsible for transporting food and wine to Brugloss, this country girl born in Butchie wouldn't have seen the business opportunity in it. But now, Amandina had taken up this role. Even though all her knowledge came from books, it was still better than the Roman who had all her knowledge from her imagination, wasn't it? What is that, Anne? The Roman finally could not help but ask. Amandina's attention was also on the row of thumb-sized crystal balls. The owner of the crystal balls was a man wearing a black robe. Not everyone in Erewhon had the right to wear such a robe, and the man was a monk. The young girl could not help but look at Brando, but the young man had an indifferent expression. She paused for a moment and could not help but frown. That is a fire seed. Amandina did not turn her head and answered softly. What is a fire seed? A fire seed is a sacred object that people use to spread civilization in the wilderness. I didn't expect to see something like this in an auction. Amandina replied. I don't understand. Amandina replied bluntly. Amandina could not help but sigh. After a few days of interaction, Brando did not disappoint her. She did not expect the person who hired her to be a noble knight, and a legendary Highland knight at that. Moreover, Brando's behavior was polite most of the time, and he was calm and collected when dealing with matters. He was in line with the image of a lord in her mind. But this fiancé of his was a bit of a headache. It was not that the Roman were difficult to get along with. On the contrary, Amandina's personality could be said to be likable most of the time. But what gave her a headache was that Amandina seemed to treat her as a moving encyclopedia, and always had a curious expression on her face as she asked this and that. But she could not refuse and could only answer, How much do you know about our world? I don't know. Amandina coughed twice and replied, Then I'll try to explain it in simple terms. In the epic of the Cruise people, their god, Ahiru, Martha, created a world out of chaos with the 6 elements of fire, wind, earth, water, life, and darkness. After the 4 elven kings made a pact, the world's boundary was formed. This boundary constantly drew the power of magic from the chaos, forming a land that extended infinitely in all 4 directions, which is the world we live in. Thus, the shape of the world should be a circle, and it should extend infinitely in all 4 directions. But this world is constantly leaning towards chaos, so Lady Martha used the law to restrict it, and fixed the order on the land where mortals walk. In these areas, the sun, moon, and stars operate normally, so mortals can reproduce, and civilization can continue, but outside the land protected by Lady Martha, there is a battlefield between the elements and chaos, and there is a vast transition area in between. These areas are what we call the barbarian wastelands. But it is not impossible to change between the land of order and the barbarian wastelands. This is where the Knight of Pioneer and the Demon Wave came from. And the fire seed is the key to planting the law on the land. A land built in the barbarian wastelands must have a fire seed. Amandina coughed and asked after she finished explaining, Do you understand? The Roman nodded, then shook her head and answered obediently, I only understood the first sentence. Ah. It hurts, Brando, let go of me. Before she could finish her sentence, she was pulled over by Brando and held in his arms. Little Roman, it seems like you are not destined to become a wizard, so don't worry about it. You should be more concerned about how much money we can earn from the auction. Brando said to her while looking back at Amandina with an apologetic look. The girl smiled faintly. She quickly walked up and asked, Don't you care about the fire seeds, Mr. Brando? As an aide, she of course knew that Brando went to buy a certificate to become a Knight of Pioneer. Brando looked at the crystal balls. He was interested in seeing so many fire seeds appearing at the same time, but he was sure that he was not the only one who cared about it. He thought that he could only give it a try later. Besides, there was a fire seed in the place he wanted to go, and he was not in a hurry to use it. I understand, I can give it a try later. Amandina looked at him, thought for a moment, and nodded worriedly. In her eyes, Brando was the kind of young knight who left home to open up his own territory. Whether he could achieve anything depended on whether he could have his own territory, or whether he could make contributions in the war. The girl also understood how long her own path was, and she was also completely dependent on it. After all, at this moment, only Brando appreciated her talent. Thus, she could not help but worry about Brando's every move. Brando saw the girl's worry and wanted to say something, but he suddenly saw Cripple hiding in the shadows and gesturing to him, telling him that the auction was about to begin, and for him and the others to hurry up. The young man was slightly startled and raised his head, and found that the people who had gathered around had already begun to enter. P.S. I'm not feeling well today, so I'll only write one chapter. In addition, I sincerely request for monthly votes and subscriptions. After staying in the hospital for a week, I discovered that my subscriptions had dropped drastically. Chapter 114. The interior of the auction house in Maria's market was not big. It was like a small, dimly lit theater. Around the stage, in the center, rows of chairs were arranged in a trapezoidal shape, but these were the seats for the ordinary guests. Around the four walls of the theater, private rooms decorated with silk and satin were distributed next to each other. There was a total of 3 floors. There was a brass telescope mounted on a mahogany shelf in the private room so that the nobles could carefully look at the goods in the center of the table. The cripple had the means to book a box for Brando, but the young man refused. His purpose in coming was not to attract attention, and participation was secondary. He just wanted to see if there were any unexpected gains. A group of people took their number at the entrance and then sat down. Although Brando looked relaxed, in fact, he always had a crossbow tied under his knight's attire. The cursed crossbow made by Tamar was loaded in the box, ready for emergencies. Won's crossbow was a sophisticated weapon, and its sight was like a standing box. It was difficult for a novice to use it flexibly. However, Brando's mercenary class gave him the skill, familiar with weapons, and the knowledge generated in his mind allowed him to use the delicate weapon like a seasoned mercenary. He even made a simple aiming device on the ring to calibrate the weapon during actual shooting. Not long after Brando sat down, and the auction had not yet started. The cripple, who was wearing a long cloak and in disguise, came to sit next to them. The cripple looked carefully and then replied, "My lord, the poison daggers and the potions have been sold. The daggers were wanted by the Brotherhood. Don't worry, they are very generous. 1 dagger for 2,500 tor, and they did not ask the seller." In the underground trade, not every transaction was made in the auction house. In fact, most transactions were done in private. The seller and the buyer made the transaction through middlemen like the cripple. Sometimes there were even several middlemen, which was safe and secretive. The buyer only needed to pay a small sum of money for the middleman as a reward and as a hush money. In Braggs's grey domain, no one had a bigger mouth than these people, and no one had a tighter mouth than these people. Everything was relative. "Where's the potion?" Brando pretended to ask the staff on the platform below to arrange the potion, but he was actually asking about something unrelated. He was well aware of the rules of the underground trade fair. Items like poison daggers and mana potions that were branded with pseudo-magic would generally not be put on the table. The potions are a little more troublesome. The person in charge of the Tower of Stars and Moon has been asking about the creator of these potions. They seem to be saying that the method of making mana potions has not been circulated outside for a long time. They said something like this: "The Wizard Guild welcomes professional alchemists to join us." As the cripple spoke, he used his small eyes to observe Brando's expression. He wanted to see how Brando would react. If the young man found this information useful, he might even praise him. Whenever his position in the group became more stable, he would feel more at ease. If Brando felt that the problem was troublesome, the cripple would feel a sense of satisfaction from taking revenge. Even though he was in the same boat as Amandina, other than fear and apprehension, there was also a trace of unwillingness in his heart. However, the cripple might have the same thoughts as Amandina. He looked at Brando, hoping that he would get rich with him, but also wanting to see him suffer. However, Brando only shook his head and replied without leaving a trace, "My friend is not interested in this. You should just tell me the situation of the trade, cripple. Seems like I'm not wrong. Mana potions are much rarer in this world compared to the amber sword. Each potion costs 1,000 tor, so the total is 30,000 tor." The cripple did not show the disappointment in his heart on his face. Brando nodded. The dagger's price was 25% higher than he expected, and the mana potion's price was also far beyond his expectations. Moon primrose, black mage, and fluorescent moss were all very common magic materials, but according to this price, a single mana potion's profit was more than 200%. This was a huge profit. He immediately categorized this item in his heart as a long-term cash cow. Brando could not help but look back at the Roman. If the mana potion was used as a brand, it would not be impossible for the little Roman to establish a merchant guild. The Roman of course noticed Brando's gaze, and could not help but raise her eyebrows. She clasped her hands in front of her chest and praised without reservation, "Half of 100,000, Brando, it's just as you said. I knew that Brando would be able to do it. The best part is yet to come, Roman lady." The Shire sat down behind Brando and replied with a smile. "No, the Shire, you must have misunderstood. Our merchant lady is just reminding me that this 100,000 tor is her capital." Brando looked down at the table below and said without a change in expression. The merchant lady did not feel embarrassed at all, as if her thoughts were exposed. Instead, she was like a little fox that had taken advantage of the situation as she covered her mouth and giggled proudly. Amandina, who was behind the Shire, could not help but raise her eyebrows slightly when she saw this scene. She was born in a noble family, and it was not like she had not handled tens of thousands of tor in cash before. However, it was impossible for someone like Brando and the Roman to talk and laugh as if it was nothing. After all, even though her family could be considered to be well off, that was all there was to it. Thus, when she saw this scene, it proved that this young knight's family was definitely not simple, even though he came out to roam the world alone. However, this young lady was obviously wrong. The Roman did not have any concept of money at all. Brando had handled tens of millions of tor's money in the game, and naturally did not put these small matters in his eyes. However, it was impossible to say what kind of background he had. The lights in the circular theater suddenly dimmed. The group turned around and noticed that the surrounding staff had extinguished half of the torches on the walls. It seemed like the auction was about to begin. Roan lowered his voice and said, "If it was in the private room, the list of the auction would have been sent to the nobles by now. My lord, is there anything you want?" "I don't know yet." Brando looked at the central stage that lit up. "Speaking of which, did they cause trouble for you after that?" Roan shook his head. "As you expected, everyone knows that you and Mr. Badham forced me to go to the streets of the Grey Rat tribe. After that, Turst's men came looking for me, but I said that I did not know you. It sounds like you're not happy about it." Badham teased. "I wouldn't dare." Now that Roan understood Badham's position, he was naturally not as submissive as before. He looked at the stage below and changed the topic. "Speaking of which, my lord, what's your ideal price for that sword?" "In my opinion, it's a perfect piece of art." Brando knew that Roan was talking about the dwarven sword that was forged from a brass-grade magic weapon. He thought for a moment and estimated, at least 100,000 to 150,000 tor coins. As soon as he finished speaking, Amandina, who was behind him, let out a soft "aw." Everyone was stunned and turned around to see her blushing and waving her hands. Sorry, it's fine." She could not help but lightly press her chest to prevent her heart from beating too fast. Amandina's light blue eyes flashed with a bright light. 150,000 Tor coins was equivalent to 150 Eroin coins. As his aide, she understood Brando's financial situation. It could be said that when they came in, they were empty-handed, but in the blink of an eye, they had a fortune that was comparable to the lifetime savings of a small noble. 200,000 Tor coins was not impossible to buy a night in a remote village. To a girl like Amandina who was born in a noble family and possessed a certain level of intelligence, money should be invested into the next step of reproduction in order to be considered liquid wealth. In the past, she was addicted to her own designs to the point that she ran out of money, but a smart person would not make the same mistake twice. She quickly calculated what she could do with 200,000 Tor coins. With so much money, whether it was business or development, it seemed like the path was open. She estimated that with this amount of money, she could increase its value by 30% in a year. But she immediately frowned. She recommended herself to be Brando's aide, and the young knight did not object, but it was hard to say if he would let her do as she pleased with such a large sum of money. But Brando saw the change in her expression and could not help but ask, "Miss Amandina?" "What?" Amandina was taken aback and raised her head. "Are you thinking about the problem of our funds?" Brando asked. Amandina's face turned slightly red, but she quickly returned to normal. The girl nodded seriously and replied, "Yes, as your aide. I feel that I need to consider this problem." As she spoke, she looked at the Roman without confidence. After all, as Brando's fiancée in name, she seemed to have the right to speak in this matter. However, the merchant lady was smiling, as sweet as ever. Brando listened with a thoughtful expression and looked at the others before replying, "If you have any ideas, I can divide the money into two. One for you, and the other for the Roman. You can use the money however you want," but, before he finished, Amandina showed an expression of disbelief. "Mr. Knight, are you serious?" Brando nodded matter-of-factly. This was his habit as the leader of the Amber Sword. He never doubted the people he used, or it could be said that he tested a person's ability by letting them do as they pleased. The girl took a deep breath and nodded seriously. "I will definitely use this money well for you, Mr. Knight. I have already thought of a plan that can increase the value of this money in a short period of time. No, I'm giving you this money because I want to tell you that I'm not going to give you the money. I am giving it to the little Roman to help me earn money, and Miss Amandina, I want you to help me use the money." "Use the money?" Amandina was stunned. "You'll understand soon enough. Of course, if Miss Amandina is interested, please help our Miss Merchant out. She has a big plan in mind." Brendel turned his head back and replied, "You'll understand soon enough. Of course, if Miss Amandina is interested, please help our Miss Merchant out. She has a big plan." Brando first thought about the matter of the territory. If the little Roman established a merchant guild, it would not be appropriate for it to be connected to the territory. If that was the case, he would need a butler. Since Amandina volunteered, he was happy to sit back and enjoy the fruits of her labor. Big plan. Amandina was stunned. She really could not think of what the merchant miss who seemed to be full of energy all day long would have. To be honest, she wanted to dissuade Brando from handing over the important task of earning money to her, but it was not appropriate for her to say anything at the moment. But she immediately put that thought away because she suddenly remembered something. Amandina's eyes lit up slightly. She immediately connected all the things that the merchant girl had told her about Bragg's festivals over the past few days. She almost immediately sorted out the general outline of the whole matter from the details. She thought carefully and turned her head to the side to whisper to the Shire, "Mr. the Shire, before you entered the city, where was the army of Madara?" "They have been in Dragos for almost half a month." The Shire replied casually. He was stunned for a moment and immediately asked, "You have thought of it, Miss Amandina?" The sorcerer's apprentice couldn't help but be a little surprised. Amandina was able to deduce the cause and effect of the whole matter from just one sentence. It seemed that the Lord's advisor was not an ordinary person. If Miss Roman's plan works, then the profit will be at least 80%. Amandina could not help but look at the smiling merchant girl who was talking to Brando in front of her. It was as if she saw another side of her for the first time. Miss Roman calculated it to be twice as much. The Shire replied. That's because she didn't calculate the channel. Amandina secretly gritted her teeth, feeling a little bit of a blow to her confidence. She thought for a moment and said seriously, but if we work hard, because of Mr. Cripple, it is not impossible to reach 100% profit. Brando, of course, did not pay attention to the whispering of his two subordinates, because at this moment, the main event of the underground trade fair, the auction, had already begun. What he did not expect was that the first item attracted his interest. It was a sheepskin scroll that was placed flat under the light. An ancient contract was written on it in the elemental language of the four races. The four corners of the scroll were slightly curled upwards because the four elements of wind, earth, fire, and water forced the edges of the scroll to bend towards the center. This scroll's existence was to open the path for those who did not have the talent to become an elementalist. Many nobles used this item to open the door to the world of magic for their children. There was no doubt that it was worth a lot. But to Brando, this item was more valuable than 1,000 pieces of gold. Because in his eyes, it only had one name, scroll to open the elemental pool. P.S. Today I went out to get medical insurance, and after running around for half a day, I was told to get it done before the 20th, sad. Because of the delay today, that's all for today. I'll write more tomorrow to compensate everyone. As for the monthly votes, I'll come back tomorrow to ask for them. Right now, Chitian is giving out monthly votes for mobile phone authentication. Everyone can give it a try. If you have the monthly votes, keep them for now. You can give them to me based on my performance tomorrow. Chapter 115. As everyone knew, the formation of the Wand originated from the contract between the god of the Cruz people, Martha, or the mother of the Erewhon people, and the four elf kings. It bound the chaos, also known as the Sea of Chaos outside the world, to form a boundary based on the 6 elements. Within this boundary, the outer layer was the elemental domain, and the inner layer was the infinite land. The power of the gods that guided the world's laws was reflected in the sky above the land, forming the sun, moon, and stars. Thus, life was born in the water and multiplied on the land. Blessed by the wind and endowed with wisdom by the fire, the mortal world was formed. However, outside of the 130 million laws set down by God Ahilu, through elemental law, the Sea of Chaos did not submit. It was also reflected in the sky, and was called the third moon by the cultists. It was also the sacred moon in the mouths of the shepherds, or the silver heavenly serpent, or the moon of magic described in the books of All for One. According to legend, the invisible magic moon would watch over the land from the west every decade during the summer moon, the moon of scrolls, and the moon of recovery. Therefore, these months were also the time when the wizards and witches were the most powerful, and also the time when the elementalists were the weakest. The magic moon at this time caused waves in the Sea of Chaos, and caused monsters to be born in the darkness under the influence of the magic moon. These monsters were what people called monsters. The magic tide drove them to attack civilized areas, causing the guardian lands of Ahilu to collapse inwards. The civilization's territory also shrank accordingly. In the early days of the Chaos era, the magic tide was a mortal enemy that almost every civilization had to face. This was also the reason why the Pioneer Knight existed. Even in modern times, the war potential of a country had to be prepared for the decline of civilization. However, the magic tide came once every 10 years, and the last time it came was just 2 years ago. It was still early for the magic tide that came once every 100 years, so people of this era were not too worried. However, after the magic tide receded, the monsters' lairs would not disappear. They would still produce monsters made of magic or mutated beasts over the years. Therefore, there were occasional reports of roads being cut off by monsters in the surrounding areas of major cities. In Erewhon, clearing out these monsters and lairs was the job of the guards and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. However, not all nests would be destroyed. In the long battle against chaos, the humans learned how to tame lairs, just like how their ancestors discovered how to tame wild beasts, using the products within for their own use. After a long period of research, the humans, elves, and even dwarves had also figured out a way to create a similar nest. For example, Buga's gargoyle lair was a classic example. Note, a typical gargoyle lair can only produce 2 gargoyles per year. However, the construction of the lair and the maintenance of the lair requires a large amount of resources. Therefore, even if a country relies on the lair as a war reserve, its war potential is not limitless. The tamed nest was similar to the Erewhon Wyvern Knight's mount and the Cruise's griffins. As well as the earth dragon, war serpentine lizard, or black wolf that people often saw. However, there was another type of nest, the Guardian's Nest. It was a nest created by Marsh's, a Healer's, order faction power. It could also be created under the influence of light, darkness, fire, wind, water, or rock faction power. For example, the Abyss of Wind in St. Osol, the Gate of Heaven in the Church's Night Nation, and the Shadow Canyon in Madara. Of course, these lairs were also divided into different grades. For example, most of the silver-winged cavalry and the guards had hound lairs. Although the annual production of these things was as high as 16, unfortunately, their combat power was only slightly higher than the average hound. Moreover, the lifespan of monsters gradually declined along with the magic that made up their bodies. Often, the lifespan of monsters was short. Even the long-lived dragon clan would disappear after 100 years. Compared to the real dragon clan, the difference was like heaven and earth. The stone nest that Brando mentioned was a type of artificial nest. It was a product of alchemy, and the monsters it produced were stone golems that had the combat power of 7 or 8 adults. This type of nest was relatively low level, but it was popular. Many nobles had such things in their territories. Even though the stone golems had low intelligence, they could still be used as soldiers. This was the first thing that came to Amandina's mind when she saw the stone necklace. If Brando wanted to build some stone nests, this necklace could save them a lot of money. On the other hand, Badam considered the increased production of the stone necklace. Thus, the 3 of them made up their minds to snatch the necklace. The starting price was quickly revealed. The stone necklace was not as valuable as the elemental revelation scroll, so its starting price was only 2,000 Tor coins. Each increment was 100 coins. Because he wanted to get it, Brando was not in a hurry to make a move this time. He waited for the others to make a move so that he did not reveal his intentions too early. The first bidder was born from the crowd. The one holding the sign was also a young knight. Amandina and Badam glanced at him, but their expressions did not change. After a few rounds of bidding, the price rose to 3,000 coins, and the number of bidders decreased. Brando understood that most of the people who participated in the bidding had a participating mentality. In fact, most of them were not really interested in the necklace. But from this moment onwards, the competition became calm on the surface, but it was intense on the inside. The right to bid was quickly taken over by the nobles on the 3rd floor. Roan told them about a few of them. Most of them were nobles outside of Brags who had their own territories. The price rose to 4,000 Tor coins, which was not a low price for the necklace. The true hunters began to compete. The starting price was 4,400, and the 3rd room on the right offered 5,000. The entire place was silent for a moment. Many people thought that the nobles had gone crazy. But even more people could not help but become restless. The sudden bid made some speculators realize that the necklace could bring them more benefits. Ripples appeared in the crowd again, and this made Brando feel that something was wrong. He knew that he had to use facts to dispel these speculators' thoughts, so he let Roan make a move. 6,000 Tor coins. Silence again. The people who were eager to make a move immediately sensed that a war was about to break out, and all of them carefully retracted their hands. 7,000. This time, the bidder was a captain of the White Mane Army, and it was taken back by a noble with a price of 7,500. Brando did not hesitate to raise the price to 8,000. Badam swallowed his saliva. 8,100, the third room on the right bid. Brando asked Roan to raise the price to 8,500, and he looked at the stage with no intention of giving up. Amandina could not help but grip the armrest of her chair tightly, and her knuckles turned white. The auction hall was completely silent, and even the nobles were silent. No one was an idiot here, and for a necklace from the Stone Legion, they would consider whether it was worth it. But Brando's considerations were different. He needed an army and a territory more urgently than anyone else. Amandina's funds were for the territory, and this was the agreement between him, Badam, and the noble's daughter. The auctioneer hammered the gavel once. The captain of the White Mane Army was eager to make a move, but he hesitated for a moment and did not make a move in the end. After 3 hammering sounds, Brando obtained the necklace as he wished. Roan's men had already used his money to pay for the necklace and sent it over. Brando looked around, and after making sure that no one was looking in his direction, he carefully kept the necklace. This necklace could only be used in the Stone Burrow, and it could only be used as an exhibit for now. After the necklace from the Stone Legion, the auction gradually heated up. First, there were a few pieces of art that caused a fierce competition among the nobles. Then, there were 2 sets of bronze level 1 magic armor. These 2 sets of armor ignited the enthusiasm of the adventurers, mercenaries, and traveling knights. The auction was heated up for a moment, and the 2 sets of armor were sold for 40,000 Tor coins. After that, there were a series of items that stirred up the hearts of the people. Brando once again obtained a set of cards that were said to have magical powers. However, he didn't want the deck of cards. He just wanted to get his hands on the card of fate that was hidden in the deck of cards. In fact, when the auctioneer had brought the set of cards onto the platform, the cards in his backpack had immediately reacted. He and Charles had looked at each other and made a prompt decision to buy the cards. This time, he did not have any strong competitors. Only a few nobles who liked strange things fought with him. In the end, he successfully bought the card for 2,500 Tor coins. When Brando pulled out the card of fate from the stack of cards, he realized that it was a green card. On the front of the card was a picture of a group of green spiders that were born from a whirlwind. The number on the card was 3, and the cost was the corresponding wind element. Wind Spirit Spiders, Alicia's Prophecy 3, Wind 1x, Creature, Elemental Insect, Level 5 Creature, Pay X and Place X Green Creatures, Wind Spirit Spiders, Level 5, on the field. When the Wind Spirit Spiders die, choose a target and burn X mana. Born from a whirlpool, return to the whirlpool of mana. When Brando scanned the description of the card, he could not help but be slightly stunned. First of all, the card to summon a level 5 creature already made him feel like he was at a loss, and the price tag and description were even more puzzling. He thought for a moment and couldn't help but turn his head and whisper to the Shire, "What does this mean?" The Shire glanced at the card and smiled. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com, there are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 116. The scroll that the auctioneer called the Scroll of Enlightenment caused a ripple in the crowd when it appeared. Low gasps of surprise spread out like ripples and quickly reached the ears of Brando and the others, letting them know that the auctioneer had successfully attracted the attention of most people from the start. But even though the people were whispering, most of them did not make a move. The nobles who were willing to compete for the scroll had a certain amount of wealth, and they sat in the boxes calmly, waiting for the first bidder. The Scroll of Enlightenment is mostly the work of the fairies of the Crystal Tundra. There is a quota of them every year, and it was originally used to replenish the number of low-level elementalists in the tribe. But there are many of these scrolls that are sold privately every year. Roan explained. Then why don't they make more of them? Roman asked. Making the Scroll of Enlightenment consumes the mana of the elemental pool. It is not a trivial matter for high-level elementalists. The Shire replied. Moreover, even though normal people can use the Scroll of Enlightenment to forcefully form an elemental contract, there is a limit to what they can achieve in their lifetime. You won't be much stronger than the average person. It's not always better to have more of these scrolls, he continued. Badam, Amandina, and Roman listened attentively. They did not expect a small scroll to have such a history. The Shire and Brando had already heard of it, but Brando still replied. I just didn't expect to see it in Bragg's. Roan's sense of smell was as sharp as a rat's. He heard Brando's words that the young man's knowledge was not limited to a small place like Bragg's, even though it was the largest city that Roman and Amandina had ever seen. He thought for a moment and asked, My lord, are you interested in this scroll? A little. Then how about I have my men bid for it? Roan asked. Brando thought for a moment and nodded. The price of the Scroll of Enlightenment was 5,000 tor, and every increase in price was 5% of the starting price. Under Roan's signal, his men quickly raised a sign on the other side. 5,000. However, with someone taking the lead, the price quickly went up. New bids came from the second and third level, and before the auctioneer could even raise his hammer, the price had already reached 8,000 tor. The bids circled around the small theater before returning to Brando. The cripple turned around and looked at him questioningly. He thought for a moment, nodded, and gestured a number. The person on the other side raised a sign. 8,500. Amandina's expression changed slightly. The little Roman was indifferent. Badam looked like he was waiting for a good show. However, a new voice came from the second floor, and the auctioneer's assistant announced the new bid, 9,000 tor. The nobles in the box were getting impatient. The second round of bidding had lost the obvious feeling of probing, and it was as if blood had been spilled. The bids were getting colder and colder, and the numbers were getting higher and higher. Starting from 9,000 tor coins, the bids were increasing by 10%, 10,000, 11,000, 12,000. The auctioneer and his assistant were calm, but there was no need for any introduction. The bidding had entered a white-hot stage. However, the price was not high enough for these nobles. Finally, a faint voice came from the fourth box from the left. 15,000. It was like the last beat of a drum in a storm. After the last shower, the sound of wind and rain stopped. The dark mass of people sitting below felt suffocated like the audience in a theater, thinking that this was the final nail in the coffin. Roan smacked his lips and turned around. Brando frowned. This was a question of whether it was worth exchanging 16,000 tor for 2,000 experience. He hesitated for a moment, then patted the back of his hand. The cripple raised his placard again. 16,000 tor. The crowd paused for a moment, and they knew that this was the most important moment. The auctioneer's assistant saw the sign in the audience and could not help but mutter, "Is Roan crazy? We didn't ask him to do that, and the nobles will not be happy." The auctioneer looked at his assistant and said, "There's someone behind him." When Brando made the gesture, Amandina and Badam turned around to look at him. They did not understand why the young knight was so interested in the scroll. Did he want to become an elementalist? But didn't the wizard apprentice say that even if he used the scroll of enlightenment to become a low-level elementalist, his achievements would be limited? This scroll was prepared for those with talent, and it could save them the time they wasted on accumulating their elements. However, Brando did not explain. The Shire did not need to explain either. He understood why the young man was so interested in the scroll. Cripple's bid caused the voices in the private rooms above to pause for a moment. The nobles seemed to be wondering who this sudden competitor was. But in just a moment, a new bid was placed on the heads of the people below. 18,000 tor. It was still the fourth box from the left. Roan whispered into Brando's ear, Baron Donner. His family has several manors near Braggs, and he also has some property in Braggs. He's also a member of the local council in Braggs. His father and grandfather were both members of the council. Brando nodded. These nobles could be seen everywhere in Erewhon, but a small baron would not go so far as to fight over a scroll. The other party might be the representative of some important person. While he was still in shock, the bid had already risen to 20,000 tor. A knight in the third box and the baron were clearly going all out. As the two of them bickered, the bid rose all the way to 26,000 tor. However, the nobles in the first box finally took over, and the price was like a knife that was swung over the heads of the people below. In the blink of an eye, the price had reached an astronomical figure of 40,000 tor. Brando participated in the bidding again when the price reached 20,000 tor, but he was immediately refreshed by the representative of the nobles. In the end, the scroll was sold for 42,000 tor, which made the young man feel a little regretful. After all, it was 2,000 tor experience. If he could buy it with 20,000 or 30,000 tor, it would be good. However, 40,000 tor was a little too much, and it might even affect his plans. Brando gritted his teeth and could only give up on this deal. However, he did not show it on his face, and did not let Amandina and Cripple see any clues. They just thought that this young man came from a wealthy family and did not care about this little bit of money. After the first small climax of the auction, it entered the smooth transition that Brando expected. After that, several items were sold, and the prices were between a few thousand and 10,000 tor. The transactions were ordinary, and the people present were a little bored. However, Cripple found something to do. He introduced the origins of these items to Brando and the others. He might not be able to tell which workshop the magic ring that emitted light like a candle came from, but he could at least tell where it came from, and which noble family secretly leaked it out. Amandina, Little Roman, and Badam listened with great interest. Only Brando and the Shire discussed the origins of these items. They mentioned Tamar once, and they could not help but feel that it was a pity that this master alchemist could not participate in the auction because he was too focused on his work. Otherwise, there would be some items that he liked in the previous auctions. The second climax of the auction came quickly. This time, it was a necklace. To be precise, it was a few stones that were strung together with a rough rope. Those who did not know the value of this item might miss it, but Brando almost cried out when he saw this necklace. The necklace of the stone army. This item was used together with the stone burrow that was made with level 17 alchemy. It could reduce the consumption of the stone puppets by 50% and increase the production of the puppets. He explained the use of this necklace to the others. Roman and the Shire were not affected, but Badam and Amandina's eyes lit up. One of them was a mercenary who had been in the battlefield for many years, and the other was a noble's daughter who had received a noble's education. Of course, they understood the usefulness of this necklace. In Wound, the war relied on three resources. The first was the people, the second was the amber stones, the third was all the other strategic resources, and the fourth was the burrow. There was no need to explain the people. In the vast land of Wound, the power of magic gave birth to a population that far exceeded the limits of this era. They were the basis of the potential for war between countries, and between territories. Amber ores were separated from the Somir ores. They were minerals that were associated with silver, gold, and copper. The transparent amber crystals had the ability to store mana, and Amandina's mana conduit device was designed to convert the power of these ores into mana. It was the foundation of the magical system of all the intelligent creatures on the land, and also the blood of this industrial system. The other resources, such as food, metal, wood, and stone, were the most common strategic resources even in Brando's original world. They were stored for war. But the last one, the burrow, was a complex concept that was different from the war that we were familiar with. But as a player, Brando was familiar with this concept. In fact, when it came to burrows, one had to start from the origin of wound. How did chaos exist? How did order come to be? How did magic work on the land? Where were monsters born? How did their burrows become used by humans? If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. Chapter 117. The Shire smiled when he saw the card. My lord, this is a rare wind card. Among the 6 cards of fate, the wind card is the rarest. The wind card spells are flexible, good at defense and counterattack. It is difficult to master, but it is powerful. Why don't you just tell me how to use it? Brando rolled his eyes. The Shire chuckled. The meaning of this card is that when my lord displays this card, in addition to paying 1 wind EP from your elemental pool, you also need to pay additional mana from your mana pool. Every mana point can summon a wind spirit spider. Brando was stunned. He had 9 willpower and 15 mana points. Doesn't that mean he can summon 15 rank 5 wind spirit spiders at once? But Charles wasn't done yet. He continued, the dead wind spirit spiders will create a mana whirlpool. Each of them will absorb some of the mana in your enemy's mana pool. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air. How is this summoning spiders? This is clearly a group of living mana bombs. If he had a few hundred mana points in the future, wouldn't he be able to summon an army of wind spirit spiders at once? And if he was lucky enough to obtain the legendary orb of mana pool, wouldn't he be able to summon a terrifying mana-burning army at any time? He smacked his lips. At first, he thought this card was useless. But now, it seems that not only was it useless, it was also a terrifying killing machine. But before he could finish his excitement, Badam couldn't help but clap his hands and shout. Good, the show has finally begun. Brando raised his head and saw the glittering dwarven sword on the stage below. The faint green light on the surface of the sword almost explained its attributes. But the auction house obviously treated this as one of the last few items to be auctioned. The auctioneer picked up the sword and said, This is a sword forged by the dwarves. It is like a work of art, and its value is not low. I don't need to say more. However, on top of this perfection, an outstanding alchemist forged it into an outstanding magical sword, magic sword, he repeated. The auction house was silent for a moment. Those low-light magic items and pseudo-magic items were generally called alchemy items in public. However, only those truly powerful treasured swords could be labeled as magic swords. Since the auctioneer said so, it was obvious that he was holding such a treasured sword. There wasn't a single adventurer, mercenary, or knight who wouldn't be tempted by a weapon they could wield. That was why they couldn't help but hold their breath when they heard that. But as if to prove his words, the auctioneer suddenly swung his sword backward. Sparks flew as the sword hit the anvil behind him. Almost everyone in the auction hall heard a soft sound. After the sword passed, a deep cut appeared on the metal surface. Not only that, the traces of corrosion on the cut left a deep impression on everyone. Everyone sucked in a breath of cold air. Even the private rooms above were silent for a moment. The auctioneer put down the sword and clapped his hands. This sword is called the Heart of the Tree. The starting price is 25,000 tor. Every increment must be at least 5% of the starting price. Now, let's begin. Amandina frowned when she heard the starting price. Isn't it a little too high? She was a noble's daughter after all. She did not understand what a good weapon meant to those who risked their lives for it. Of course not, Badam shook his head decisively. If I didn't know that it was the Lord's work, I'm afraid that I would also bid for it. Most of the adventurers and peers here have some savings. I don't think that they would miss this opportunity. Unless he doesn't use a sword. As if in response to his words, the first bidder raised his sign as soon as he finished speaking. Then, there were people who raised their signs one after another. There was no need for the auctioneer to stir up the atmosphere, and the bidding for the sword had reached a climax. The price reached 60,000 tor at a dazzling speed, and only 4 or 5 voices were left in the hall. Cripple only recognized one of them, and he told Brando that he was the deputy commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry. Brando thought that it would be best if the commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry participated as well. He would kill the lackey of the Unifying Guild sooner or later anyway, so he could return the sword to him. When he thought of that, the price had reached 70,000 tor. At this time, another 2 people backed out. Only the deputy commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry and 2 other nobles were left. The deputy commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry raised the price to 75,000 tor and forced his opponent to back out. However, his opponent did not seem to want to give up. After a short moment of silence, the auctioneer's assistant read out the price of that person again. 90,000 tor. It was as if a layer of ice had formed on the spectator seats. Everyone could not help but turn around to look at the person in the private room. Even Cripple could not help but guess if it was Count Nakin's representative. If it's that old man Nakin, then this will become a battle between the White Mane Army and the nobles. My lord, this is good news. The cripple blinked his eyes and said with a smile. But at this time, another voice came from the crowd. 100,000 tor. Brando and the rest could not help but turn around. Badam's face changed when he saw that person, and before Cripple could say anything, he said, Lord Knight, that's Viscount Turst's man. Why is he down there? Brando asked. God knows. The red-bearded mercenary shook his head. However, Brando did not mind if this weapon fell into the hands of his potential enemy. To Badam and the rest, this was a rare sword, but to him, it was just a so-so. In the free port of Ampere Seal, such transactions happened almost every day. It was just that Braggs was too secluded. The deputy commander of the Silver-Winged Cavalry thought for a while and raised the price one last time. In the end, he was defeated by Turst with a price of 110,000 tor. The nobles in the first level accepted the challenge once again, and the price rose to 130,000 tor. He doesn't seem to be Count Nakin's representative. Amandina said. Brando nodded, and his heart relaxed a little. The price he had in mind was 100,000 to 150,000 tor. So far, it could be said that he was quite satisfied with the result. Even if he paid the processing fee, he would still get close to 160,000 tor. At least, it was more than enough to carry out the next step of his plan. But the heavens seemed to want to give him a surprise today. Just as Turst was about to withdraw, a new hunter entered the fray. The new hunter bid 155,000 tor, and even the auctioneer could not help but put down his hammer and look at the third level of the noble's box in shock. He could not help but wonder who was in there. Brando turned around to ask Cripple, but he could not come up with an answer even after thinking for a long time. The nobles in the first level finally hesitated. After thinking for a long time, they bid 160,000 tor. But the mysterious person in the third level immediately counterattacked, and the price was raised to 170,000 tor. 170,000 tor. Brando, Amandine, Badam, the Shire, and Cripple looked at each other. Even if it was a magic sword, it should not be worth this price. No one responded for a long time. Not only the participants, but even the audience below was deathly silent. The auctioneer took a deep breath and finally reacted. Shakily, he raised the hammer. After 3 bangs, the exciting performance finally came to an end under everyone's doubts. What happened just now? 170,000 tor. Badam patted Cripple's face. Cripple, have you seen so much money before? Even Cripple, who was known for his vast experience, felt that it was unreal. Even though it was not the first time he saw hundreds of thousands of tor in an auction, the money had nothing to do with him. But this time, the money was more or less related to him. This little bit of connection was enough to make the profiteer of the Black Pepper Alley speechless. After all, he had been a loan shark for 20 to 30 years, and his savings were only a few tens of thousands of tor. Amandine clenched her sleeves tightly as she tried not to show any signs of shock. However, her expression was extremely awkward, and Seal couldn't help but laugh at it. When Brando went to see the little Roman, Amandine was very happy. She happily took out a small notebook and said, "Brando, we have capital now." Brando smiled faintly. On the other side, the auctioneer seemed to want the auction to end in an exciting fight. Brando's heart of the tree was taken away, and the new item on the stage made everyone hold their breaths. Fire seed. Heavens, it's a fire seed. Someone is auctioning a fire seed. Exclamations rang out in the small auction hall. Brando turned around and said to the Shire, "This is the highlight of this auction." "It's a pity, or else our heart of the tree could have been the highlight." The Shire nodded. But Brando's words did not mean that it was a pity. He continued, "Every single one of Erewhon's fire seeds were produced by the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The Javier sect is selling them so openly, it seems like they are trying to raise money. But everyone knows that the Javier sect is siding with the royal family. I don't know what the royal family is doing this time that they need to use such a method to raise money." The Shire thought for a moment and replied, "Maybe it has something to do with the war." Brando thought for a moment, but there was no record of it in his memory. He nodded noncommittally, then raised his head and felt that the atmosphere around him had changed. A sense of tension had spread all around him, and he could not help but think that someone had already received the news and was prepared. "Are we going to participate?" Amandine asked from behind. Brando thought for a moment and decided not to participate in this game of big fish eating small fish. At least based on the current situation, the 200,000 tor that he had just received would not be able to gain any advantage in this competition. He shook his head and was about to say something, but the light around him suddenly dimmed again. What are these people doing now? Badam could not help but curse. But Brando and Roan had already seen the change in the auctioneer's expression. "There's a problem." The young man and the black-hearted merchant reached for the nearest weapon at the same time. Then, without any warning, the torches on the walls suddenly extinguished, and the surroundings suddenly fell into darkness. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 118. The surroundings were plunged into darkness. The screams of the ladies immediately filled the air. Brando and Cripple did not have time to look around, and had already drawn their swords from under their cloaks. Badam and the Shire's reaction was just a bit slower. The red-bearded mercenary unsheathed his palm-sized greatsword from his back and pressed down on Cripple's shoulder. He was afraid that Cripple would play any tricks, and then he and the young apprentice surrounded the ladies to protect them. Cripple snorted lightly, but he did not seem to mind. After the ladies lost their heads out of fear, the men's angry and questioning voices sounded from all around them. On the contrary, the hall on the first floor was quieter because most of the people sitting there were experienced adventurers and mercenaries. Most of them had experienced many battles, and were able to calm down and prevent the chaos from spreading. "Brando, did something happen?" Romaine's voice asked curiously in the darkness, but there was no trace of fear in her voice. Amandina sat behind her and gripped her skirt nervously. Her fingertips were white as she gripped it tightly. But she squinted her bright eyes and did not show her fear. "Shoo," Brando said. He had already seen a few impatient youths and nobles lighting up matches or glowing gems on their staffs. But some of the lights were extinguished. Beginner-level light magic was not uncommon in the lives of ordinary people in Vaunt, and even in some large cities, the street lamps on both sides of the street were made of crystals enchanted with light magic. Cripple had a ring that glowed, but he was not in a hurry to polish it. Raising a light source in the darkness would only make him an eye-catching target. But sometimes things did not go as planned. Just when Brando and Cripple were looking around to make sure there was no danger, the sword in Cripple's hand flashed. He was slightly startled, and then looked at the sword in his hand that emitted a faint light. At first, the light was like a layer of fluorescence on the blade of the sword, but in the next moment, the light from the raised sword illuminated the surroundings in a snow-white light. With this bright light, Brando and the cripple didn't have time to be surprised. They saw 4 uninvited guests in cloaks quickly passing through the narrow aisle between the rows of seats and rushing towards them. Their hands were under their cloaks, and it was obvious that they were holding on to their weapons. He was an enemy, not a friend. "Brando!" Badam shouted from behind. Brando did not say a word. He decisively raised his left hand and shot out a series of crossbow bolts from his sleeve, nailing the cloaked stranger in the lead. The steel bolt had a huge impact at such a close distance, and the cloaked figure fell to the ground with a groan. He rolled backwards, and his companions moved to the sides to make way for him. Then they raised their heads and looked at Brendel's direction. Brando happened to see a pair of burning orange-red flames hidden deep under their hoods. "It's the undead." He was startled. How could these things appear in this place and at this time? But the situation did not allow him to think too much. The hands of the 3 caped freaks, which had been hidden under their cloaks, reached out. It was a withered, armored hand, and it clenched a strange one-handed scythe. Brando actually didn't know whether the strange weapon should be called a scythe because it looked more like a bright, semicircular starfish, but the barbs and sharp blade on it made him guess that it was obviously not as simple as an ornament. Curses only had a weak effect on the undead, so the young man gave up the idea of wasting the crossbow bolts in an instant. He pulled the young Roman behind him and at the same time retreated between Badam and the cripple. But the 3 cloaked strangers had already pushed aside the people in front of them and rushed over. Their target was obviously Brando, and the 3 scythes were swung at him without hesitation. Brando raised his sword and blocked the scythe of one of the cloaked strangers. The huge force from the sword almost made him retreat 3 or 4 steps and almost knocked over the seat behind him. The young Roman screamed, but Amandina had already grabbed his hand and dragged him over. The noble girl hugged the merchant girl and lowered her body to the ground and crawled in another direction. She was extremely nervous, but her mind was unusually clear, as if her every move was a subconscious one. Badam also stretched out his sword from behind to block a cloaked stranger, but he immediately groaned, obviously not feeling too good. "Upper iron ranked strength." The red-bearded mercenary shouted. "Undead terracotta." Brando at this time also recognized the identity of his opponent. Undead terracotta was a type of puppet creature, but it was just an evil creature that was created by a necromancer injecting a warrior's soul into an empty armor. In the game, the level 31 to 33 undead terracotta was the main force of Madara's irregular army, but they were agile and good at hiding their presence. They were Madara's assassins. Brando felt that the undead terracotta he was facing was at least a captain, and its strength was close to a silver ranked. It was not considered an expert in Madara's irregular army, but compared to Insursta's undead army that Braggs was facing, it was an elite force. Their target was him. Brando was a little confused for a moment, but the undead terracotta in the hall had already begun to attack everywhere. The mercenaries and adventurers who were attacked panicked and screamed in panic for a moment. Brando felt that his strength was not as strong as the opponent, so he simply pulled back and threw a chair at the enemy. The undead terracotta captain swung its odd-shaped scythe, and the chair was instantly shattered into pieces. But the young man took the opportunity to stab the undead terracotta's heart, which was also the core of the undead terracotta's soulfire. The undead terracotta captain let out a hoarse roar and quickly grabbed Brando's elven sword. Silver-white flames immediately rose from between its fingers, and the purifying fire penetrated deep into the soul and bone marrow, causing the undead to scream immediately. But not only did it not let go, it instead swung its scythe at Brando's arm. Damn it! Brando gritted his teeth. It was not that he had not fought against undead terracotta in The Amber Sword. But that was after he had reached a very high level. But even so, the opponent's fearlessness left a deep impression on him. That was why when the undead terracotta captain grabbed the Thorn of Light in his hand, he felt that something was wrong. He immediately let go of his hand and took a step back, dodging the enemy's scythe. At such a close distance, without the Thorn of Light, Brando had lost all means of attacking. He could still use the Ring of the Wind Empress, but he could not guarantee that he would not injure the Roman and Amandina. There was not enough Earth EP to pay for the Holy Sword card, and it was useless even if it lost energy. The Wind Spirit Spider could be used, but at this distance, before he could summon the Wind Spirit Spider, his opponent would have already chopped him into pieces. The hesitation only lasted for a moment. Brando immediately lowered his center of gravity and suddenly leaped forward. He grabbed the undead terracotta captain's waist and slammed him down, causing the undead terracotta captain to lose his balance. Together with Brando, the two of them crashed into 3 rows of chairs. Brando's body was in so much pain that he felt like his bones were about to fall apart, but his mind was very clear. He immediately got up with the undead terracotta captain. The undead terracotta captain grabbed its scythe. Brando immediately grabbed the elven sword that had fallen to the side. The undead terracotta captain seemed to be struggling to get up, but Brando was faster than it. He activated the charge skill and rammed into the undead terracotta's chest. The power of 10 times the speed was terrifying, and the undead terracotta captain that was close to a silver tier was sent flying in the opposite direction. At the last moment, the undead terracotta captain stabbed its scythe at Brando's shoulder. Wood tenacity! Brando shouted in his mind. His skin quickly turned into wood, but the undead terracotta captain's scythe had already broken through the layer of faint blue light around his body. It was the magic defense provided by the conflicting aura, and cut deep into his wooden skin. Blood splattered everywhere. Brando clenched his teeth to prevent himself from screaming, but he was in so much pain that he broke out in cold sweat. He threw the scythe on the ground, and looked at the undead terracotta captain that had fallen into the crowd. He did not dare to delay and immediately took out the Wind Spirit Spider card. Display, Card of Fate, Wind Spirit Spider. A row of attributes immediately appeared in his vision: Wind Spirit Spider, 8 HP, 4 MP, 1, 9 Strength, 2, 7 Dexterity, 1, 0 Vitality. The last 3 stats were all. Its attack method was bite, basic damage 1-1. Its special ability was incorporeal. Incorporeal creatures can only deal 1/3 of the damage, so the undead terracotta captain that had lost its weapon would have a hard time killing the spider. But Brando knew that the undead terracotta captain was not only facing one Wind Spirit Spider. There were 15 of them. He pointed forward, and 15 large and small green whirlpools immediately appeared behind him. Spiders with half of their bodies made of whirlwinds shot out from the whirlpool. These little creatures were like rays of green light. After a few turns on the ground, they shot towards the terracotta captain who had just stood up. One wind spirit spider had the strength of 2 ounces, and although the strength of 15 spiders could not be simply accumulated, it was enough to stop the undead terracotta captain that was close to a silver tier in strength. The spiders hung on its body and bit with all their might. The undead terracotta captain screamed in anger and threw the spiders on the ground, but its actions were futile. Because Brando had already grasped the opportunity. While the undead terracotta captain was distracted by the wind spirit spiders, he rushed forward and stabbed his sword into its chest. The terrifying undead terracotta captain wanted to resist at the last moment, but its movements were distorted by the spiders. In Brando's eyes, it was full of loopholes. The sword pierced through the heart. The undead terracotta captain screamed in dissatisfaction, and its vital parts were heavily injured, causing the thorn of lights, purifying flames, to deal 4 times the damage in an instant. Brando watched as the undead terracotta swayed and turned into a pile of ash-gray armor in the pure flames. 700 EXP obtained. He turned his head and saw Badam, the Shire, and Roan working together to fight against the 2 undead terracotta's attacks. Amandina had already pulled the Roman to another side to hide. Then, a loud noise came from above the auction hall. Brando raised his head and saw a black shadow falling from the box above and crashing to the ground. There was a moment of silence in that direction, and then a series of screams sounded. Sir Rosal. Lord Martha, it's the vice-captain of the Public Order Cavalry, Mr. Rosal. They killed him. Brando's heart tightened when he heard this. It seems like these damned undead terracotta aren't here for me. Insursto wants to attack the higher-ups of the Brags. What is he trying to do? There is no record of such a thing in history. While he was puzzled, he suddenly saw the doors on the side of the trapezoidal theater suddenly open. There were a total of 5 doors, and rows of white skeletons holding bows and arrows walked out from behind the doors. The youth's eyes narrowed in an instant. So many undead. What is the manager of the auction hall doing? What are the Public Order Cavalry doing? What are the Silver-Winged Cavalry and the Public Order Cavalry doing? How did they get in? Brando wanted to curse at this moment. P.S. What a tragedy, because it's too painful to only have a small bowl of porridge for every meal. I couldn't help but eat a piece of squid and some rice. Now, I'm starting to rebel again. I don't know if it's the squid or the rice. I'm better off dead than alive. Everyone, please pay attention to your health. In my pain, this is the only chapter for today. Please forgive me. If you still want to ask for votes, I'm ashamed __, smiley face, to be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 119. The snow-white skeletons stopped in their tracks and raised their bows, the metal bows creaking and groaning. The mercenaries and adventurers below finally realized that something was wrong, but the undead terracotta in the hall held them back and prevented them from escaping. Brando's first thought was the Roman, but when he looked up, he could not find Amandina and Romaine's silhouette. He panicked and swung his sword. The silver blade left an afterimage in the dim environment, and the wind pressure split 3 chairs in half, hitting the undead terracotta that was fighting with the Badam. The undead terracotta leaned to the side, and the red-bearded mercenary seized the opportunity to slash the undead terracotta in half. With a crash, the undead terracotta fell apart, and several silver balls of light rose from its remains and shot into Brando's body. At the same time, the Shire helped Roan to push back another undead terracotta. They turned around and saw Brando shouting, "Do you see the Roman? We're here." Amandina held the Roman's hand and stood up on the other side. The merchant did not know what fear was, and waved her hand vigorously. "Get down." Brando shouted at them, and then ordered the Shire wall. The young wizard apprentice understood and immediately raised the ruby. Countless lines extended out from the ruby in all directions. The Shire used all his strength to cast a spell, and his mind and magic flowed like water. The wall of law extended to 50 meters, and covered Amandina and the Roman on the other side. Then, hundreds and thousands of lines shone slightly and disappeared in an instant, and a wall of air formed out of thin air. At this moment, the skeleton archers had finished their preparations. Their bowstrings vibrated in unison like a storm. The arrows shot down, leaving behind black lines, scattered downwards. The guests in the first row fell down in unison, while the ones behind also fell to the ground one after another with a muffled groan. But the Shire saved even more people. Every time the air wall was hit by an arrow, it flashed with a white light. The wall flashed dozens of times, and finally, the fluctuating light connected into one. However, the wall had finally awakened the shocked crowd. Among them, there were many apprentices and low-level elementalists. There were even 1 or 2 intermediate wizards. Most of these people did not understand what was going on at first, but now they understood. They stood up, twirled the rings on their fingers, or simply chanted aloud. The wizards stretched out their hands, and streaks of white light appeared from the crowd, extending towards the door above the auction house. There were even 1 or 2 weak fireballs. What followed was a series of explosions. Air currents, bone fragments, dregs, wood shavings, and dust flew everywhere. At least Brando saw several skulls bouncing and rolling down not far from him. Then, smoke and dust filled the entire hall. Brando coughed twice, but his coughs were drowned out by the noise of the surrounding people. He casually pushed aside a mercenary who bumped into him and shouted to the top. "The Shire, Roman, come down. Come to me." Brando was worried that his voice was not heard by the people above, but soon he saw Badam rushing out of the smoke with the fainted cripple in his arms. Behind him was the Shire, followed by Amandina and the young Roman. Amandina's face was covered in dust, and she looked like a little fox with a smeared face. When she saw Brando looking at her, she could not help but embarrassedly stick out her tongue. "I thought the Shire's wall would not affect me. Brando, I'm sorry." Even though she spoke with a tone of lingering fear, the expression on her face clearly said, "That was exciting, I really want to do it again." Brando slapped her forehead in annoyance. He looked at Amandina and replied, "You can thank Miss Amandina later. Now is not the time. Come with me, we'll leave this place first." Amandina coughed and replied softly, "There's no need for that." She raised her chin slightly, and there was a faint trace of pride in her heart. She was born as a noble, and more or less inherited the pride of Erewhon's nobles. Amandina did not tell anyone, and Borg did not know what to do. The Nesson family's complicated crest had an eye-catching lily symbol. Even though it was only at the top of the crest, the symbol was exactly the same as the lily of the Covardo royal family. This meant that this noble family was once a branch of the royal family. Even though they had declined, the hidden nobility in their bloodline still existed. In fact, the inspiration for the mana conduction device came from a dusty blueprint in the family's basement. Otherwise, with her mediocre talent, she would not have thought of this path. But Amandina never thought of admitting defeat. The more her family fell, the more she wanted to revive the deeds of her ancestors. Unlike her noble father, she had always been a competitive girl since she was a child. But Badam's words interrupted her thoughts. The red-bearded mercenary asked carefully, "Where do we leave from, Sir Knight?" "I don't know how many of these monsters are out there, and I don't know how they sneaked in. The cripple even said that the underground auction was heavily guarded. Damn it, we'll leave from the backstage. Brando looked around at the hazy surroundings and answered. He already had a plan in mind. It seemed that Madara's target was the high-ranking nobles from Bragg's side who were participating in the auction. Then, their main target should be the box above. But what made him shudder was that the 3 undead figurines were clearly coming for him. He did not know how he attracted Madara's attention. The young man thought about it again and again, and the only thing he could think of was whether the news of him leading the refugees had spread out through some channels. But he only killed a platoon leader. Did Immerse have to seek revenge for the smallest grievance? To gather information about him and the others, and to plan this operation, it must not be an easy task. It would not be an exaggeration to say that they had mobilized a large force. Brando could only hope that he was only an extra target in this operation. But no matter what, he realized that his existence had gradually begun to affect the course of history. This made him feel a sense of urgency. Otherwise, his advantage would gradually disappear. The Shire also agreed with Brando's opinion, but he obviously wanted to take it a step further. This young wizard apprentice had clearly analyzed the previous discussion between Brando and him regarding equipment, attributes, and experience. His suggestion was that leaving from the backstage was obviously more advantageous for them to fish in troubled waters. The auction items and money that had not been sold in time were obviously a huge treasure trove. If Freya was here, she would definitely express her dissatisfaction with the Shire's suggestion. But it was a pity that this kind and righteous future goddess of war was waiting to be rewarded at the headquarters of the Silver-Winged Cavalry. As for Amandina, who replaced her as Brando's assistant and advisor, although she was born in a noble family, the nature of nobles in this era was not much different from bandits. Moreover, this young lady had always been a pragmatist. When she heard the Shire's suggestion, not only did she not stop it, she immediately supplemented it with her own wisdom, striving to make the plan more feasible. As for the little Roman and Badam, the former was eager to participate in all the exciting and amazing adventures, and did not care whether this was illegal or not. Moreover, the underground trade itself was not something that was legal. As for the latter, as Brando's retainer, he would not object. Not to mention the unconscious cripple, even if he was not unconscious, he would probably raise both his hands and feet in agreement. Just like the rumors that were circulating in Bragg's bar, if there was anything that would make the cripple of Black Pepper Alley happier than taking advantage of others, it would definitely be taking advantage of others. Seeing that his nominal subordinates were still thinking about how to earn money in such a dangerous situation, Brando could not help but wonder if this was a good thing or a bad thing. But speaking of which, this style was exactly the same as his performance in The Amber Sword. Back then, Sophie, who would risk her life for money, was a well-known name for a period of time. Of course, that was also because he was too poor in the early stages of the game. Later on, when Erwin disappeared and he joined the Church of Knights Nation, this reputation gradually left him. But the adventurous nature of his style was deeply rooted in his blood. Whether it was Sophie or Brando, they were all potential gamblers. And his style of doing things more or less influenced the Badam, the Roman, and the Shire. As for Amandina, he turned his head to look at this girl. Her personality was a little similar to his. The few of them had a plan and immediately approached the auction stage below. But they quickly realized that there were many people who had the same idea as them. But under the obstruction of the undead terracotta, there were not many people who could rely on 2 warriors who were close to the iron-ranked level and 15 wind spirit spiders to pave the way. Because of that, they were the first to break through the obstruction of Madara's assassins and arrived at the stage below. The first thing that Brando saw was the auctioneer and his assistant lying in a pool of blood. The place where the tinder should have been on the stage was already empty, and the treasure that gave a lot of bonus points was nowhere to be seen. This made him frown. There were 2 possibilities. One was that the undead had taken the tinder, and the other was that there was something to think about. He and the Shire looked at each other and saw the doubt in each other's eyes. The tinder was an invaluable treasure to most intelligent beings, but it was not the case for the undead. Madara used the soul fire and the psionic tower to expand their territory, so the tinder was almost worthless to them. This information might not be known by normal people, but it could not be hidden from a veteran in the game and a wizard's apprentice. For example, Brendel and the Shire. There's a problem. Brando immediately put his sword in front of his chest and reminded the people behind him. The Shire also protected the back of the group at the same time. What's going on? Badam asked. However, as soon as he finished speaking, a red behemoth descended from the sky and landed on the platform with a boom. With a loud crack, the red behemoth created a huge hole in the wooden platform, causing the entire platform to be filled with smoke and dust. P.S. It's better today. Sigh, I still can't eat meat. What a tragedy. If I recover tomorrow, I will start to make up for what I owe these 2 days. Sigh, I hope everyone can forgive me. It's already the 30th today. Please continue to ask for monthly votes and subscriptions. Chapter 120. When the red giant fell, the wooden platform immediately cracked, and debris flew in all directions. Brando covered his face with one hand and looked forward. Through the smoke and dust, he saw a giant skeleton about 3 people's height standing up. It wore a huge crusader helmet with a fiery red hydra pattern on it. Brando sucked in a breath of cold air when he saw it. This was Madara's general's guard, the Crusader Executioner. Brendel felt his scalp go numb. It was as if a bucket of cold water had been poured over him from head to toe. Even his heart had turned cold, and he did not even have the mood to fish in troubled waters. But now, he did not care at all. He almost could not speak, but he coughed and did not dare to hesitate. He immediately said to the people behind him, "Retreat, retreat, leave this place, follow me." His voice was rarely stern, and he was not even this nervous when he faced the undead army. If he could, he would have cursed out loud. What are those bastard guards of Bragg's doing? They let this thing in, why don't they just open the gates and surrender? Badam and Amandina might be a little confused, but Brando knew what the Crusader Executioner was. In this place, it was not an exaggeration to say that it was the Grim Reaper. This was not an ordinary undead creature, and it was not even a type of undead summoned by a necromancer. It was a nest creature. Madara only had a few types of high-level undead, and it was one of the undead that had a physical body. The only other undead that had a physical body were the Flesh Golem and the Black Knight. It was a high-level undead. It had the strength of a mid-level silver. Brando saw that the Crusader Executioner did not seem to have recovered from the shock of falling from the sky. He did not think about anything else and immediately pulled the others to the left. There was a small door under the platform that led to the backstage, and that was their goal. Badam and the Shire reacted quickly. The veteran mercenary immediately felt the aura of despair from the Crusader Executioner. It was a kind of aura that was filled with killing intent. Perhaps only a veteran like him could taste this kind of aura. This giant skeleton wearing fiery red armor and holding a giant axe was definitely not to be trifled with. The group quickly passed under the platform, but the bad news was that the undead had finally stood up, and the only enemies around it seemed to be their group. Brando pushed Amandina and Roman into the door, followed by the Shire and Badam. He looked back. The 2 red soulfire and the monster's black eye sockets had locked onto them. It raised its axe and stood shakily from the platform, making creaking sounds. Brando. Roman was confused. Don't say anything, listen to me. Brando immediately entered the door and closed it tightly. Fortunately, the door was made of pure iron, and they did not know whether it was for defensive purposes or not. That was why they were able to hold on for so long. Is that thing very powerful? What should we do? Badam asked. Brando calmed down and replied, let me think, I might have an idea. He calmly released the wind spirit spiders as he spoke, and allowed them to crawl out of the room through the cracks. In an instant, he had a draft in his mind, but he was a little hesitant. Wasn't this too dangerous? His greatest hope was that the monster would go after the others. After all, there were so many people in the hall, and it was not worthwhile for it to chase after them. But before he could finish his thought, the iron door suddenly shook, and the huge force from the door made him fall forward. The others were shocked, and Badam and the Shire quickly rushed forward to block the door. Brando crawled up from the ground and returned to his original position. At this moment, he finally gave up on any hope and said with determination, there is only one way. You guys run first, split up. I'll hold this thing back. Brando. It was the first time that Roman saw the young man's uncertain expression, and the excitement in her heart seemed to have been washed away. Her worry was the same as when she was in Butchie. She wanted to stay and face the enemy with Brando, but this time, the young man wanted her to leave first. This was not a battle that belonged to her. Brando knew that the Crusader executioner's strength was close to 47 ounces, and it was not something that the current Badam and the Shire could fight against. If they fought against this monster, they would only be killed in an instant. The Shire was fine, at most he would not be able to use his Highland Squire card for a while, but Badam, Cripple, Amandina, and the little Roman were all people that he could not afford to lose. He had thought it through in an instant. Right now, he was the only one who could use his familiarity with this terrifying monster to lure it away and find a chance to escape. But when he looked at the huge monster that had just turned its head, and the two red soulfire and its black eye sockets locked onto them, he was not confident at all. After all, this was a monster that was close to the middle of the silver rank, and it was not like the zombie Outlander Captain and Ebdon of this era who had not reached the silver rank, or who had just reached the silver rank. Brando had thought of giving up on Badam, Cripple, and even Amandina, and let these subordinates buy time for him. He had the ability to do so, because other than him, they were not familiar with this terrifying undead creature. Sometimes, a small mistake in judgment was enough to change a lot of things. In fact, such a thought flashed through his mind, but the young man shivered and rejected this tempting idea. He could not tolerate himself doing this, and even thinking about it made him shudder. He thought that if he could break his promise and give up on Badam, Cripple, and even Amandina, then one day he could give up on even more people. Freya, the Roman, the princess, and everything he held on to would become a cold-blooded monster just for himself. Brando shook his head and threw this cold thought out of his mind. In just an instant, he was sweating profusely as if he had just experienced a battle between heaven and earth. He said in a low voice, "You guys run first, split up. I'll hold this monster back." Badam stopped in his tracks. "My lord, you're the lord, how can we abandon you?" This experienced mercenary with a fiery red beard who was good at reading people's expressions completely put himself in the role of a retainer at this moment. Even he himself didn't realize it. It was natural. "My lord, this is the General's Guard of Madara's undead army. You are not its opponent, please let me buy time for you." The Shire put his hand on his chest and answered seriously. "You know it." Brando was surprised. "Brando," Amandina pulled her hand out of Badam's hand. She turned around and said with a serious face, "We don't need you to be a hero, we've entrusted our ideals to you. At least, we hope that you can reconsider your promise to a weak woman." "What are you talking about, Amandina?" Badam grabbed the girl's shoulder and lost his temper. But the second impact came quickly, and the three of them felt the terrible power of the door this time. Brando realized that there was not much time left, and he pointed his sword to the back and said in a low voice, "Since when did a woman have the right to interfere in a man's battle? Badam, take her away." "Mr. Brando, you..." Amandina was stunned, but she took a deep breath as if she suddenly understood Brando's meaning. She stopped and looked at the knight with a complicated expression. "Brando, what about me?" The Roman blinked and asked. "Aren't you a woman?" Brando replied in an annoyed tone. "Oh." The little Roman was a little disappointed. Since it was an order, Badam had no room to disobey. He could only nod and leave with Amandina and the Roman from the other side of the stage. He turned around and saw a small hidden door behind the cloth curtain. Most underground auction houses had such an emergency passage that led directly to the showroom. Sometimes it was manually or magically powered. On one hand, it was convenient to move goods, and on the other hand, it was to prevent possible interrogations. Of course, the probability of the latter happening was close to zero. At the same time, Brando also breathed a sigh of relief. If he dared to say that women should not be involved in war in the Amber Sword, the senior and leader who had been guiding him all this time would have beaten him to a pulp. But unknowingly, he had become a competent leader himself. And the old players and seniors who had gone through ups and downs with him had left one by one, leaving him to fight alone. It was like this in the game, and it was the same here. Although Brando had confidants such as the Roman and Freya, subordinates such as Badam and Reto, and the intelligent Amandina as his aide, he could not help but feel lonely. However, he still couldn't help but feel lonely. Perhaps no one would understand why he was working so hard. He turned around and looked at the Shire. The wizard apprentice still looked at him firmly and replied, "My lord, you know my identity. In a sense, your safety is more important than my life. Because even if I disappear, as long as my lord is alive, then there is the possibility of me appearing again. Otherwise, everything is meaningless to me." "You have convinced me," Brando nodded. "In that case, you can stay." The door finally opened with a click. The tip of the blood-red axe extended from behind the door. The door shook violently, and the Shire and Brando who were pressing on the door bounced back. But this time, they did not block it. Brando waved to the Shire and shouted, "Come, let's go to the other side." With that, he stood up and dragged his squire to his feet. He glanced behind him and then ran towards the door on the other side of the hall. The Crusader executioner swung the axe again and finally broke through the door. It lowered its body and crawled in. Just as it was about to look around, a ray of white light hit its head, and the spell instantly disintegrated. The terrifying undead creature turned its head and immediately saw Seal and Brendel at the side. In fact, the young wizard apprentice was still maintaining his hand gesture. "Over here, you brainless undead." Brando sneered. The skeleton in blood-red armor roared and immediately chased after them. It straightened up, and the wooden and stone ceiling was smashed into pieces like tofu. The Crusader executioner had 22-ounce agility, so although it looked huge and clumsy, it was actually astonishingly fast. As soon as it moved, its huge body was already in front of Brando with a cracking sound. But Brando already knew this, so when he saw that the Shire's attack was ineffective, he immediately dragged the ladder and rolled sideways into the door. Just as they escaped, the Crusader executioner smashed the door frame with a bang. The monster stepped on the stone chips and walked into the room. It saw Brando and the Shire had already climbed up from the other side. Brando stood up, panting, but he was not as nervous as he was when they were escaping from Butchie. On the contrary, his mind was clear at this moment. He knew that he and the Shire would not be able to deal any damage to this high-level undead, but he was not without a chance of survival. At least he knew that he had two options. The first option was to hold on until the silver-winged cavalry arrived. Although the silver-winged cavalry was a lackey of the All-for-One, he was not on the same side as Madara. Moreover, he was a knight with the strength of a lower gold rank, so it was easy for him to deal with this monster. He did not even need to do it himself. The silver-winged cavalry was the elite of the White Mane army, and the platoon leaders were all at least silver rank. Any one of them could easily kill this brainless undead. But the Crusader executioner was right in front of him, and he doubted if he could hold on for that long. It was not impossible for him to lose his head in the next moment. After thinking about it, Brando realized that it was more realistic to rely on himself, so he could only choose the second option. And that was to find the Elemental Revelation Scroll. P.S. It hurts, I shouldn't have eaten that squid. I really only ate one, why is it so strong? My stomach hurts so much today. He clenched his teeth and wrote 2 chapters. This is the first chapter, the second chapter will be released later. I'll grit my teeth and beg for a guaranteed monthly ticket for next month. Everyone, please support me when you see that I'm seriously injured and can't leave the front lines. Chapter 121. He needed to find the Scroll of Elemental Enlightenment. In fact, using the Scroll of Elemental Enlightenment to open the elemental pool did not take much time. Since it was the first time the elemental pool was opened, it would absorb the rich elemental power contained in the scroll. The 4 elements would then fill up the new, almost shapeless small pool. As long as he had those elements, he could pay for the holy sword. With the sacred sword, even if he couldn't deal with this thing, he should have no problem protecting himself. This was also the reason why he released those spiders before. He thought that the wind spirit spiders, born from elements and magic, would be better than him in finding such an item. Brando instantly figured out the whole plan. He turned back and shouted, "The Shire." "I understand, my lord." The young sorcerer apprentice turned his head and smiled. "Good luck, my lord. I hope to see you again sooner." Brando nodded seriously. His wizard squire had already raised the ruby in his hand. Countless white lines stretched out from the ruby between his thumb and index finger. These white lines, or rather, the part of the 130 million laws that were set by Martha on the other side of the world that were related to defense, blocking, and reaction forces were selected in an instant. They lit up and intertwined with each other. The solid wall emitted a golden light and then disappeared into nothingness. The skeleton in blood-red armor swung his axe and swept it on the wall. Ripples spread out in circles. The ruby in the Shire's hand cracked, but this little wizard apprentice continued to maintain his spell at the cost of overdrawing the medium. "Let's go," he said in a low voice. Brando turned back and looked, then turned and pushed open the door on the other side and rushed out. He did not know who had the Scroll of Elemental Enlightenment at the moment. Although it was said that the underground trade could be done on the spot, the nobles wanted to maintain their dignity. Therefore, they would usually let the auctioneer send the auction item directly to their residence after the auction. So he had a chance. He quickly walked through the corridor. The showroom was in the direction that Badam and the others had left in. However, such a building would usually have an emergency passageway. If he could find it, it would be much easier. However, he opened the doors on both sides one by one. As he continued to be disappointed, he gradually became anxious. Soon he heard a loud noise behind him. It was the sound of the Crusader. It did not seem to have given up on chasing him. "The Shire is dead." Brendel could not help but check his own status. The Highland Squire's card was showing a rare grey color, and it was displayed in the center of all his cards. It was the same for the Wind Spirit Spider card. The previous loss had caused half of the card to turn grey. It seemed that summoning cards would face the threat of a graveyard. He hesitated for a moment before recalling the rest of the Wind Spirit Spiders. It was difficult for him to find the right target in this auction house alone. However, the Wind Spirit Spiders that were born from elements and magic would have a much easier time finding the location of the Elemental Revelation Scroll or the person who held it. But when he turned around, the voice behind him caught up again. It seemed that the terrifying undead did not intend to give him the time to do so. At the same time, a wind spirit spider shot out from one of the rooms and landed at his feet. It stopped for a moment, then immediately scurried in another direction. Found it. Brando was shocked and immediately chased after it. He was much more agile than the wind spirit spider, so it was not difficult for him to keep up with it. However, the heavy voice behind him was getting closer and closer. His heart could not help but beat faster. How far was it? Would it catch up with him? Was it the elemental revelation scroll? There were too few factors that he could be sure of, but Brando could only grit his teeth and take a gamble. He turned around the corner with the little green creature and saw a few corpses lying on the side of the aisle. They seemed to be the staff of the auction house. There were enemies. Brando was alarmed, but he immediately saw a few skeleton soldiers wearing black chainmail and holding long swords staggering out from the doors on both sides of the aisle. He immediately heaved a sigh of relief. The young man immediately activated his charge skill and ran past these low-level undead like a gust of wind. About a month ago, these skeletons were his mortal enemies, but now they were no different from real cannon fodder in front of him. The first skeleton in front of Brando's eyes slowly extended its sword towards him, but Brando's speed was 10 times faster. The skeleton's sword was still in the air when the skeleton's hand was separated from its joint. A white flame emerged from the wound, and the flame was quickly directed to the skeleton's body by a ray of silver light and set it ablaze. Brando ran past 7 skeletons in an instant. He withdrew his sword and the skeletons immediately fell apart behind him. But the young man did not have time to be happy because he saw the blood-red figure chasing him around the corner. 22 OZ agility against less than 10 OZ agility. The Crusader Executioner raised his axe and stabbed towards Brando like a shadow. The ceiling cracked in front of him, but this resistance could not negate a few OZ agility. Brando could not avoid it at all. He could only brace himself and use his strength to slash at the axe. When the elven sword and the axe clashed, there was a sharp screech that made one's teeth ache. The sword immediately bent at a strange angle, and Brando felt as if his right hand was breaking apart inch by inch, and he lost his sense of direction in an instant. He only felt himself and his sword fly backwards and hit the wall with a bang. The only fortunate thing was that he happened to land by the door where the wind spirit spider stopped. He immediately gritted his teeth and ordered the wind spirit spider to pounce on him while rolling into the room. At this moment, he really hoped that Martha would bless him. The elemental revelation scroll was displayed in the room. But when he rolled in, he raised his head with a heart full of hope, but he saw something that he did not want to see the most. A spirit terracotta turned its head around from the side of a mercenary's corpse. It obviously did not expect someone to be outside. The undead creature was holding a single scythe dripping with blood. It turned its head and stared at Brando with the faint green flames in its eye sockets. And the young man saw that it was holding something in its other hand. It was a sparkling and translucent crystal ball with a raging flame burning inside. Tinder. The spirit terracotta subconsciously raised its single scythe, but Brando reacted faster than it. He used his left hand to support his numb right hand. The sharp pain almost made him tremble, but he still gritted his teeth and shouted, "OSS." The huge wind pressure caused the air in the room to shrink slightly, and then it exploded with a loud bang. The strong wind almost formed a straight line, and the spirit terracotta's armor instantly shriveled, deformed, and then flew backwards and hit the wall. The wall also collapsed inwards, and with a bang, a huge hole opened up. The strong wind formed a radiating shockwave, and all the obstacles in front of it were destroyed. The spirit terracotta was only an iron-ranked monster, and it was not a monster that focused on defense like the gargoyle. Naturally, it was destroyed in an instant, just like the swordsman in Pine Fortress. With a crack, the spirit terracotta that had lost its upper body knelt on the ground. Brando then pounced forward and snatched the tinder from its hand. He did not know if this thing was useful, but at this time, he did not care so much. He turned around and saw the Crusader Executioner holding the crushed wind spider spirit that was still dripping with green liquid. The terrifying undead creature saw that Brando had nowhere to run and could not help but grin. This grin did not represent its intelligence, but the instinctive desire of a dark creature to kill. "Grin my ass." Brando raised the tinder with his left hand and clenched his teeth. The crystal ball suddenly shattered, and a fiery red ring of light spread out from the inside. This ring of light first went past Brando, and then it expanded 10 times in a breath. It went past the Crusader Executioner. The monster was raising its axe, but it suddenly stopped, as if it was immobilized. At that moment, all the wizards and elementalists that had magic power in their bodies within a radius of 10 miles around Bragg's changed their expressions. They stopped what they were doing and looked in the direction of Bragg's city. The red ring of light continued to expand. It went past the auction house, the whole of Hood District, Bragg's city, and then the outskirts of Bragg's city at an astonishing speed. It spread out for a few miles before it slowly stopped and disappeared. Although this moment was short, all the soldiers in the Silver-Winged Cavalry's camp in Bragg City saw their shadowhounds vaporize in an instant and then disappear. That was the power of order. The undead creatures also worshipped the only true God, Martha. Like humans, they were also creatures of order. When the tinder was ignited, the reorganization of order should not affect anything that was originally under order. However, the Crusader Executioner was different. It was a nest creature. No matter if it was man-made or natural, except for the only Guardian's nest. All nests were in fact the power of chaos, but when the tinder was ignited, they were also the first to be affected. Low-level creatures like the Shadowhounds could not even resist and were vaporized directly. And the Crusader Executioner was also affected by the huge impact and could not move for a while. From what Brando saw, it suffered nearly 110 points of damage at that moment. The young man could not help but let out a sigh of relief. At least he made the right bet. Although no one had ever thought of using a priceless tinder to test something as boring as this, there were some basic rules in this world that could not be changed. For example, the absolute opposition between chaos and order. The young man took a deep breath, then got up and ran for his life. There was not much time left for him. At least the Crusader Executioner would not stay still forever. He had to find the scroll of elemental revelation as soon as possible. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheatyin.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 122. Just as Brando rushed out of the room, the skeleton in red armor behind him began to move. It struggled to turn half of its body, and its movements gradually became smooth. At the same time, a few wind spirit spiders crawled out of the ruins and returned to the young man. Brando found that there were 4 of them left, but 2 of them clearly indicated that they had found their respective targets. The wind spirit spiders could speak the wind language of Tenairu. Although Brando did not actually master the language, he seemed to be able to understand what they meant. The thing was not far from him. Tenairu is the place where the wind spirit king lived in Wonde. Its full name is Tenairu's Wind's End, or the Mountain of Storm's End. A large number of wind elementals gathered here, forming different tribes. Their language came from the ancient runic language family, the wind language, and was one of the few languages that still had magic power. Therefore, the wind language of Tenairu was also a compulsory course for the elementals, especially the storm envoys. This allowed him to breathe a sigh of relief. But with the intelligence of these little creatures, they could not tell whether the magic item they found was the elemental revelation scroll that he needed. Brando had to make the judgment himself. There were 2 targets in total. One was about 30 meters away in the south, and the other was about 50 meters away in the west. Brando thought for a while. The possibility of the west leading to the exhibition room under the auction stage was higher. But the danger of going back the same way was self-evident. While thinking, he recalled 2 of the wind spirit spiders, in case the card accidentally entered the tomb. On the other side, 2 soul fires were reignited in the dark eye sockets of the undead. Brando knew that he did not have much time, but his current situation was not good. The Thorn of Light was lost in the rubble, and he did not have time to find it. The Shire was also gone, and his right arm was almost broken. He still could not feel it. The wind spirit spiders could not help much, and the ring of the Wind Empress was still in a charging state. The exhaustion of his magic power was accompanied by a faint sense of exhaustion, but fortunately, he still had more than half of his strength left, and his life was not lost. He stood unsteadily on the walkway, his thoughts flashing like lightning. The cursed bolts could not help much against the undead, but perhaps there was another option, which was to break through the window on the 2nd floor and go to the crowded street. However, this would not prevent the terrifying undead from continuing to pursue him. Life waves were extremely sensitive to the undead, and there was no way it could not find a person in a crowd. In particular, in the open, it was even less likely that he would escape from the Crusaders' hands. It wasn't that the Crusader executioner didn't have any weaknesses, but the absolute difference in strength made him unable to do anything. He could almost hear the sound of the undead behind him moving again. Brando shook his head to get rid of this thought and quickly moved forward along the corridor where broken walls could be seen everywhere. In just a short moment, this small auction house seemed to have encountered a storm. The previous competition had irreversibly changed the terrain here. However, he wasn't in the mood to care about that right now. As long as the undead caught up to him, he wouldn't be able to run more than 10 meters away. I need to think of a way. He suddenly saw the remains of a skeleton soldier not far away, which should be his masterpiece not long ago. He had an idea. Crack. The giant skeleton wearing blood-red armor had already walked out of the room with a battle axe in its hand. Its huge body was half-stooped, and its yellowish ribs were like bone swords inserted into its spine, surrounded by a burning flame in the middle. It was only wearing shoulder armor, a helmet, and a simple skirt armor because under the protection of its bone plates were stronger than ordinary metals after being tempered by the power of chaos. It turned its head, and the empty corridor was silent. It was stunned for a moment. Previously, the life waves had told it that the weak human was moving along this corridor, but now, that feeling had become undetectable. Brando lay flat next to the remains of the skeleton. He gently exhaled and then held his breath. He tried to calm his heartbeat and slow his blood circulation as much as possible so that he wouldn't be too eye-catching in the undead's eyes. As expected, the Crusader executioner slowed down. The signs of Brendel's life force gradually weakened in its gray vision. It was a little doubtful, and the remaining cunning instincts made it slow down its steps. It didn't want to fall into a trap. However, it wasn't completely unable to see Brando, and the young man understood that. He carefully removed the black steel sword from the skeleton soldier's claws, his movements slow and gentle. Brando felt that although his heartbeat was slow, every beat was very powerful. It was like a drum covered with leather, beating on his fragile nerves. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but the huge skeleton inevitably came closer. It was less than 10 meters. At this distance, if the general guard of Madara attacked, Brando's head would be separated from his body. He couldn't help but turn his head once or twice, as if subconsciously making sure that his head was still on his neck. The undead took another step closer. Brando could no longer remain calm. The game had trained him to be calm, but now he was gambling with his life. He glanced at the tall skeleton. The General Guard of Madara was known for its speed, ruthlessness, and slaughter throughout the battlefield. The giant axes in their hands were nearly 4 meters long, and when they hit with full force, they had more than 20 tons of force. Every time they fought on the battlefield, the humans had to pay 10 or even 100 times the price. In the war records of Karsuk, the necromancer used dozens of general guards to disperse an entire infantry regiment of Erewhon. On the frontline battlefield, these huge monsters were like moving iron towers in a chaotic battle. Terrifying legends about them could be found everywhere. Of course, the humans also had those famous elite troops that could match them one-on-one. But Brando hadn't reached that level yet. When the Crusader executioner's eyes fell on him, his heart couldn't help but beat faster. His blood began to circulate faster, and his life force seemed to become obvious again. The tall undead paused for a moment, and a cold aura suddenly shrouded Brando's head. It had seen through his trick. But only a few seconds had passed. Brando felt his forehead was cold. If he moved a little, he would be attacked, but even if he maintained this state, he wouldn't be able to hold on for more than a few seconds. He stared at his attribute interface, thinking that a few seconds wouldn't help at all. He needed more time, a little more. He suddenly made up his mind and rolled to the side. The huge skeleton immediately reacted. It raised its battle axe, and the cold light reflected from the metal side hit Brando's face, making him pale. The gigantic monster was like a gray ghost. It moved more than 10 meters in the blink of an eye. It swung its axe to the side and created a crack in the wall. The cold edge of the axe was like a plow plowing through bricks. The broken bricks and the wood embedded in the wall protruded outwards, forming a deep trench that was moving forward at a high speed. The auction house was in an underground passage. The walls on both sides were reinforced, but under the abnormal strength of the Crusader executioner, they were as fragile as a piece of tofu. It swung forward, and the wind pressure and the crack suddenly extended towards Brando. But the young man made a feint. He rolled to the side, and at the same time, he kicked hard on the ground and jumped in the opposite direction. The huge skeleton's axe was destined to hit the ground, and with a loud bang, the stone floor cracked, and stone fragments flew everywhere. But Brando jumped between the legs of the huge undead. The Crusader executioner let out a roar from its hollow neck. This was the scream of the soul, and it wanted to stab its feet with the axe. But Brando dodged left and right, and had already climbed up and grabbed its thigh bone. Every time the huge skeleton wanted to turn the axe, the long handle of the axe was stuck in the ceiling. In the blink of an eye, Brando had already dodged 3 attacks. It finally woke up and reached out to grab the cunning human. 15 seconds. Brando had held on for long enough. When the huge skeleton of the Crusader executioner grabbed downwards, Brando immediately lowered his head to avoid it. The moment his charge skill entered cooldown, he activated it at the same time. In a flash, Brando had almost twice the agility of the monster. He rushed forward like a continuous shadow, and at the same time, he slashed the wall in front of him with a charge skill. Close to 20-ounce power bombarded the wall. The black steel sword let out a cry and broke inch by inch. But the wall also caved in with a loud bang, and the bricks became crisscrossed. Brando threw away the sword and punched with his left hand, and the wall collapsed. He jumped into the wall, and as expected, it was the other side of the room. The wind spider spirit had already gone through the sewer to wait for him here. He was close to his target. But the Crusader executioner was even closer. Brando did not dare to be slow, and with the last bit of acceleration, he rushed out of the room like a meteor. Just as he left, the huge skeleton behind him roared and smashed through the wall. It shrieked and raised its head, its hands parting the broken wall, allowing the dust to fall and slide down the helmet. Then, with a loud bang, it squeezed in. The two of them, one in front and one behind, started a chase in the narrow space. The auction house was very unlucky. The Crusader executioner was like a human bulldozer. The wall between wood and stone could not withstand a single blow from its power of close to 50 ounces. As it moved forward, any wall would crumble into powder. In just a moment, it passed through 3 walls. From the outside of the auction house, a part of the circular building had collapsed. Brando anxiously calculated the distance. There were still 2 more rooms. He casually took out a dagger from his belt and threw it back, but the Crusader executioner did not stop, and directly knocked it away. The sharp blade only left a white scratch on its bones. It raised its head, and what it faced was a winged spider spirit, but the huge skeleton casually punched it into a green sauce. Brando passed through another room. The Crusader executioner raised its axe for the second time, and this made the young man feel a chill down his spine. It seemed that there was not enough time. If you want to know what will happen next, please log on to www.cheedian.com and read more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Translator, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation Editor, Endless Fantasy Translation. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.